The lecturer is Professor Robert Waples, Professor of Economics and Chair of the Department of Economics at Wake Forest University. Professor Waples earned a double BA in Economics and History from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a PhD in Economics from the University of Pennsylvania. He has taught in the Department of Economics at Wake Forest University since 1991. Professor Waples regularly teaches 3 courses at Wake Forest University: Introduction to Economics, Current Economic Issues, and American Economic History. He also has taught courses in labor economics and microeconomics. Professor Waples is the director of EH.net, which operates the Economic History Services website and several electronic mailing lists to provide resources and promote communication among scholars in economic history and to make research in economic history accessible to the worldwide public. He edits EH.net's book review series and is the editor of the Encyclopedia of Economic and Business History. In addition to research on historical American labor markets and the U.S. monetary system, Professor Waples has published numerous articles on consensus and disagreement among economists, edited 2 books, and written a study guide in microeconomics. His PhD dissertation, The Shortening of the American Workweek, an economic and historical analysis of its context, causes, and consequences, was awarded the Allan Nevins Prize for the Outstanding Dissertation in American Economic History by the Economic History Association. In 1999, Professor Waples won the Economic History Association's Jonathan Hughes Prize for Excellence in Teaching Economic History. Professor Waples prepared the course guidebook that comes with these lectures. The course guidebook includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, and a bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture.
Economics begins with the concept of scarcity, which exists whenever your wants or desires exceed your resources or what's available to you. Everybody faces scarcity, mainly because our wants are so vast. We always seem to want more of something. Our desires are virtually unlimited. On the other hand, our resources are limited. Our most fundamental resource is probably our time, and it is distinctly limited. We all have only 24 hours in a day and 60 minutes in an hour. What would you like to do with the next hour? You could exercise, make a meal, eat, pray, take a nap, read a book, prepare for a meeting. The possibilities are virtually endless. You could even listen to a couple of great course lectures from the teaching company. But you can't do them all. You might like to do them all, but you can't. You've got to prioritize. Individually and collectively, because of scarcity, we've got to prioritize with the rest of our resources too. The problem is that almost all choices involve trade-offs. If you get more of one thing, you generally must get less of another thing. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman popularized a wonderful way of summarizing the fact that choices involve trade-offs. He said, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." No such thing as a free lunch. Economists, therefore, point out that the cost of something is its opportunity cost, the best other thing that you could have gotten with your resources, what you sacrifice to get it. And you just about always sacrifice something. So, how do people make their choices? Economists generally assume that people are rational utility maximizers, and they use utility as a synonym for welfare or well-being. Rational maximizers, in the words of Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, act in a consistent manner with a reasonably well-defined notion of what they like and what their objectives are, and with a reasonable understanding of how to attain those objectives. Economists assume, therefore, that people reason. In practice, this generally means that when they make a decision, people implicitly or explicitly weigh the expected cost versus the expected benefit of the action. And Are you ready for something really radical? If they think the expected benefit is greater than the expected cost, they do it. But if they think the expected cost is greater than the expected benefit, then they don't do it. This is the working assumption that I have about almost all the other people in the world. And to me, it's hard to think of a good general alternative. And I'm not the only person with this assumption. A poll of professional economists asked whether or not they agreed with the proposition that individuals are rational utility maximizers. And the vast majority, 70% of the economists, agreed with that statement. Only 13% disagreed. The rest were neutral. The bottom line is that most economists think that most people act as rational maximizers most of the time. And our whole analytical toolkit is framed by this approach. Economists, in other words, give regular people, like you, me, your aunt, your neighbor, the lady who cuts your hair, or the guy who changes your oil, credit for being capable of thinking successfully about what's in their own self-interest. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this, but rocket scientists can do it too. The rationality assumption doesn't mean that economists approve of all or even most individuals' actions. The assumption simply says that people are pretty good at weighing costs versus benefits from their own point of view. Now, let's dig deeper into how people make their decisions, how they weigh costs and benefits. It turns out that many, perhaps most, decisions are made on the margin. That is, they're questions about whether or not one should do a little bit more or a little less of something. We make marginal decisions, a little more or a little less, all the time. And the rational maximizer assumption implies that we opt in favor of doing more if we expect the extra benefits of the actions to exceed the extra costs. Here's a situation we've probably all faced. It's a cold day, you wake up to a chilly house and you think, what temperature should I set the thermostat to? You begin to click up the thermostat setting 1 degree at a time. Where should you stop? No one I know would stop at, say, 25 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, your house would be an icebox and your pipes might burst. The marginal benefit of extra heat is huge at such temperatures. The extra cost of warming the place up past the freezing mark is pretty low in comparison. As the house gets warmer, you feel more comfortable. First, you can take off your winter coat, and then your sweater, and then your shoes and socks. If you're like most people, as the temperature rises higher and higher, the extra benefit from another degree gets lower and lower. Warming the place up 2 degrees from 68 to 70 probably gives you a greater increase in satisfaction than warming it from 70 to 72, which yields more extra satisfaction than warming it from 72 to 74. At some point, maybe in the mid-70s, it's perfect and you wouldn't want it any warmer. The extra benefit of another degree then falls to 0. Okay, so what temperature do you pick? Do you heat it all the way up to the upper 70s so that you can walk around the house barefoot in short pants and a light shirt or blouse? Most people don't, because they've got to worry about paying their heating bill. They've got to prioritize. They want to be comfortable, but they also want to eat, have nice clothes, save for retirement, send their kids to college, and a lot of other stuff. The more money they spend on heating, the less they can spend on other things. The opportunity cost of more warmth is less of these other things. The rational maximizer in us says, I'll click up that thermostat whenever I think the extra benefit of another degree outweighs the extra cost of another degree. Going beyond this temperature isn't sensible. Why warm it up to the point where the cost of the last degree is greater than the benefit? Stopping short isn't sensible either. If an extra degree brings me more additional benefits than additional cost, I should warm up the house. Weighing these costs and these benefits, you have a usual temperature, maybe 70 degrees, which you aim for, right where the extra benefits of more warmth balance out the extra costs. Sure, it might be more comfortable to have the place a bit warmer, but making it warmer takes away resources from other things you'd like. And you've got to prioritize. You put on your socks and a long-sleeve shirt in the winter rather than wasting money warming things up too much. Note, that not everyone stops at the same temperature, because not everyone has the same circumstances, tastes, or resources. When you go to bed or step out of the house for a while, the benefits to warming it fall, so you turn down the thermostat. If you're afraid that you're about to catch a cold, you probably turn up the thermostat. If your budget is tight and you need a scrimp for other things, you probably turn down the thermostat. And if the price of heating fuel goes way up, you may cave in and turn down that thermostat. Now let's shift to the decision of how much fuel to buy to heat your home. Suppose that you have an oil-burning furnace. If heating oil sells for $2 a gallon, you'd like to buy 100 gallons this month. If the price rises to $3 a gallon, you decide to scrimp a little bit and lower the thermostat, burning only 80 gallons, so that you don't have to cut back on buying other things too much. If the price falls to $1 a gallon, you're happy to turn up that thermostat a bit and burn, say, 110 gallons. These combinations of prices and quantities are your demand curve. And most people respond the way that we've just described, buying more when the price falls, buying less when the price rises. Each person's demand curve depends on their circumstances, and their overall demand is likely to rise if they earn a higher income or if the weather turns colder. If there are, say, 10 million households just like this one, the quantity demanded at $2 is 10 million times higher, equaling 1 billion gallons a month. How much do we collectively buy, and what price do we end up paying? This depends on our demand, but it also depends on the supply from the oil producers in the market. Supply is determined by the marginal cost of producing the good. For oil, it will reflect the cost of exploring for, drilling, pumping, shipping, refining, and distributing the last gallon. In some places, for example Saudi Arabia, the cost of extracting a barrel of oil is very low. But as suppliers around the world collectively increase their production, the cost of the last barrel gets higher and higher. This rising marginal cost curve is the supply curve. If the market is competitive, the price will settle at an equilibrium level where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. Let's suppose that this price is $2 a gallon. At this price, the 10 million households in the market will buy 1 billion gallons, the exact amount that the suppliers are collectively willing to supply. If the price is lower, say $1 a gallon, people will want to buy more, but the suppliers won't be willing to sell that much. Seeing that demand is greater than supply at $1, the suppliers will notice that they can increase the price. And as the price rises, they're willing and able to produce more. Thus, if the price is below equilibrium, it will be pushed up, and pushing it up will eliminate the shortage. If the price is above the equilibrium, the opposite occurs. At $3 per gallon, the suppliers are willing to sell more than 1 billion gallons. But the buyers don't want to buy this much. There's a glut on the market, and suppliers will be forced to cut the price to sell their goods. The price will fall until the glut disappears. The glut disappears at the price where supply and demand are exactly equal at $2 per gallon in our example, and 1 billion gallons. This outcome is very appealing because, in one very important sense, the quantity of the good produced in this market, 1 billion gallons of heating oil, is exactly the amount that we would want it to produce, what economists call the efficient amount. Let's explore efficiency. People value their first few gallons of heating oil per month immensely. Without it, they would freeze and their pipes would crack. As they use more and more heating oil, the marginal benefit of each extra degree of warmth in their homes generally gets lower and lower. But how much do they value each gallon of oil in dollar terms? The demand curve tells how much people want to buy at each price, but it simultaneously tells how much people are willing to pay. If you're willing to buy 80 gallons at $3 a gallon, It's because the 80th gallon is worth about $3 to you. When the price falls to $2 and you buy 100 gallons, it's because the last 20 gallons are worth less than $3 each. In that 100th, it's worth exactly $2. Thus, the demand curve is also a willingness to pay curve, and you are willing to pay equal to what you think the marginal benefit will be. Now, let's think about how many gallons should be produced in the entire market. 1 billion gallons? Less or more? There's something appealing about that billionth gallon. We value it at exactly $2. And the extra cost of producing it? Exactly $2. If we go past the billion gallon, there's a big problem. The marginal benefit of the heating oil falls as we consume more and more. And the marginal cost of extracting, refining, and distributing it rises as we're forced to turn to less and less productive oil wells. Thus, past the billionth gallon, the marginal benefit of an additional gallon is less than $2, but the marginal cost is more than $2. Should we produce something that people value less than $2 when the cost of producing it is more than $2? No, we should not. That would be wasteful and inefficient. On the other hand, stopping short of 1 billion gallons is also inefficient. The barrels that come before the billionth are somewhat more valuable to us than the billionth. The amount that we're willing to pay for them is a bit above $2, but the extra cost of producing these gallons is lower than the billionth. So if we stop 1 million gallons shy of the billionth, we've failed to produce 1 million gallons that people value a little bit more than the cost of production. If we stop short then, we blew it by neglecting an activity whose benefits exceed its costs. We settled for too little, and we missed a great opportunity. What this simple standard analysis has just shown is that a competitive market gravitates to the price and quantity where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. In our example, it's at a price of $2, with 1 billion gallons of heating oil being produced and consumed. But this quantity, 1 billion gallons, is also the efficient amount, the quantity at which the marginal benefit exactly equals the marginal cost. Not too much, not too little either, just the right amount. The market has done something almost magical. The equilibrium amount is the optimal amount. To steal a line from Adam Smith, it's almost as if an invisible hand has guided us to this point. This is why economists like competition. The interaction of numerous buyers and sellers, each pursuing their own self-interest, has brought us to a socially desirable outcome. If this were the totality of economic analysis, we would conclude that all we need to do is set up competitive markets and set people off on their merry, self-interested ways, and everything would be hunky-dory. However, this obviously isn't the end of the story. Sometimes markets don't behave like this, and we usually want more than efficiency from our markets. Let's consider the numerous reasons that markets can fail to achieve efficiency. The first reason is that the market may not be competitive. If there's only one seller of heating oil in the area, it might be able to act as a monopolist. Monopolists jack up the price, inducing consumers to buy less than the efficient amount. Fittingly, there are numerous government policies that attack monopolies and make collusion among sellers illegal. The second reason that the market may not achieve efficiency is that buyers and sellers might ignore some of the costs. Producing heating oil generates some nasty fumes, which harm people's lungs. Such pollution is called a negative externality by economists. This pollution is part of the marginal cost of the heating oil, but because this cost isn't borne by sellers or buyers, they tend to ignore it. The marginal cost of the last gallon of heating oil sold will now exceed the marginal benefit due to the additional cost of the fumes. The market will therefore produce too much heating oil. To rectify things, we're apt to ask the government to make this polluter pay these additional costs. A third reason that the market might not achieve the efficient level of output is that the buyers and sellers might ignore some benefits. In this case, we might ask the government to subsidize the activity because the market will produce less than the efficient amount. For example, one reason that we often subsidize education is that people other than the learner may benefit from his or her education. A fourth reason that the market might not achieve the efficient level of output is that the price is somehow blocked from moving to equilibrium. An important example would be that wages are sometimes very sticky, which leads to unemployment, and we ask the government to do something about the unemployment. A fifth reason is that the good in question isn't a private good, unlike heating oil. Public goods are those that can be used simultaneously by everyone and from which no one can be easily excluded, even if they don't pay. It's very hard for the market to produce such goods because producers can't force free riders to pay for them. In such cases like flood protection, we call on the government to tax people and force them to pay. A related case is a common resource, a good that's privately used but from which no one can be excluded. Fish in the sea are an example. Each fisherman realizes that he better get out there and catch the fish before his competitors. Who cares about next year? The fish that I leave to reproduce for next year will be caught by my competitor anyway. If this logic prevails, they will collectively catch more than the efficient amount of fish. A final reason that the market may not achieve the efficient level of output is that sellers, and especially buyers, might be confused or misinformed about their own interests. What they perceive to be their marginal benefit isn't their true marginal benefit in our eyes. They make their decisions not based on reason, but on emotions or personal weakness. For example, they may be too forgetful, lazy, or weak-willed to actually turn down the thermostat when they leave the house empty for a long period. For these reasons, we may cautiously ask government to stop some people from doing things that we think harm them. Oh, you'd like to snort cocaine? A lobby of concerned citizens might say, sorry, no rational person would really want to do this, so we're going to stop you or at least deter you. If there are hidden costs or benefits from something, we often call on government to make sure people know about them. For example, the Surgeon General's warning. However, most economists are wary of pushing such paternalism too far. These are the major reasons that markets fail to achieve the efficient level of output. Lack of competition, externalities, impediments to equilibrium, public goods, common resources, and lack of information. Throughout this course, we'll run into all these forces, especially externalities or third-party spillovers. However, even when markets achieve efficiency, people sometimes don't like the result, which brings in what may be the major reason we collectively ask government to intervene into the economy. Going back to our heating oil example, the equilibrium price was $2 a gallon, and 1 billion gallons were bought and sold. However, there's a family in our town who doesn't have very many resources. At $2 a gallon, they decide to scrimp on warmth and they set the thermostat at 60 degrees. If they burn more fuel, it'll take money away from food and the ability to pay the rent. They have made a tough but rational decision given their circumstances. But many people have empathy for them. If the thermometer is set this low, their kids are likely to catch colds or worse. While the market is efficient in this case, they set their thermostat where the marginal cost and benefit of warmth are equal. We're concerned, and we collectively redistribute resources to them, subsidizing their heating oil purchases or giving them some monetary assistance. Life and the market aren't always fair, and we want them to be. In fact, in dollar terms, such redistribution through programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance and temporary assistance for needy families is the main activity of the federal government. But the line between what's fair and what's unfair is often hotly contested, and economists cannot decide such questions. These are not the only economic roles of the government. We've skipped over what's probably its most fundamental role, providing the peace and security that we need to live meaningful lives, and to take our economic resources, our time, our talents, our tools, and our property, and use them to produce valuable things. If we didn't have government to enforce property rights and stop us from stealing from each other, we would spend most of our time lying low, hiding our assets, and not producing things for each other. Without government as a night watchman or umpire to our disputes, life would probably be, in the blunt, pithy phrasing of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. However, as Hobbes and common sense point out, we can't let government become too strong, or it will be the one taking away our life, liberty, and property. As I've just outlined, economists are fond of the market. If people are rational, their self-interest will often yield an outcome that is economically bountiful and efficient. However, lack of competition, externalities, impediments to equilibrium, public goods, common resources, and lack of information can derail this outcome, and economic efficiency, getting the most value out of our resources, does not guarantee fairness, which is why we often invite government to help out. However, we cannot be naive. Just because government has the ability to make things better doesn't mean that government will make things better. How will the government act? The subdiscipline called public choice economics warns that people behave along the same lines in the political arena that they do in the economic arena. We don't turn into angels or Einsteins in the voting booth, nor do elected officials and bureaucrats ignore their own self-interest. The government spends billions of dollars each year on things like spy satellites, cancer research, and school libraries. Does it spend too much or too little? Let's consider the example of spy satellites. I know that we need a few spy satellites to keep an eye on the troop movements of our enemies. Do we have too many, too little, or just the right amount? If you're like most people, you don't have a clue. Economic logic helps explain this too. Learning about the optimal amount of spy satellites would require me to do a lot of research, sucking away hours and hours of my precious time. The marginal benefit of me knowing this information, on the other hand, would probably be insignificant. Armed with the knowledge of the optimal number of satellites, I would phone up my congresswoman who would make sure that the government had just the right amount, right? Oops, I guess that's not how it actually works. Instead, I know that my knowledge won't affect anything. The benefit of me knowing the best amount of spy satellites is approximately zero. Knowing this, I don't learn about the optimal amount of spy satellites. I am, in economic parlance, rationally ignorant. Rationally ignorant. Doesn't that have a beautiful, if seemingly oxymoronic ring? In fact, most of us voters are rationally ignorant about scads of vital policy issues, the very policy problems that we hope government will solve. We know that the marginal benefit of obtaining this information is unlikely to exceed the marginal cost, and rationally remain ignorant. Politicians are aware of our rational ignorance too. They hope to get elected, but they know that doing so takes a lot of good PR and advertising, and you can get this by seeming to do what's good for the public and perhaps accepting contributions from people often dismissed as special interests. How many spy satellites should we put up? Seasoned politicians know that voters rightfully have no idea, but that putting more than the efficient amount up might be politically wise, because it will attract more contributions and allow them to take credit for spending money in the district. Meanwhile, the bureaucrats who work at the relevant agency are ready to testify that the costs of doing so are lower and the benefits are higher than disinterested analysis might suggest. They do this because spending more money in this area boosts their agency's funding, power, and prestige, and it boosts their career trajectory. Plus, the bureaucrat was probably attracted to this agency by a heartfelt belief that more needs to be done in the area. I don't want to sound cynical, because I'm not, nor naive. But the logic of rationally ignorant voters, office-seeking politicians, and self-interested bureaucrats suggests that we'd be very lucky to get a political outcome that matches the economically efficient one, and that government involvement may actually make things worse. So we've got to be wary. This applies to the number of spy satellites, but I could easily have substituted some other example, from pollution cleanup to road construction. We must be wary of self-interested, politically connected people dressing up projects that benefit themselves and convincing us that they are for the broader public's good. Economists call this rent-seeking behavior. Thus, we must acknowledge that just because government intervenes in a market, it won't necessarily improve things. Both the market and government must be examined with a critical eye, and that's just what we'll do throughout this course. Here's a quick recap of this lecture. Economists believe that people know their own self-interest pretty well. Competitive markets work pretty well at delivering what we want. However, sometimes markets do fail, and in these cases, government may be able to make things better. But we shouldn't be too naive about government. For a host of reasons, it can fail too. This course will use the approach that I've just outlined to examine and grapple with some of the most important issues facing economic policymakers in the United States today and in the years to come, such as boosting productivity, dealing with global climate change, and strengthening the Social Security system. The next lecture will survey the recent record of the U.S. economy, which by most measures has performed remarkably well. The forces generating economic growth are ubiquitous, and, as we'll discuss in the third lecture, most economists foresee continued, robust economic growth for generations to come. Each subsequent lecture will consider a particular economic problem. As we approach each of these issues, we'll assess the magnitude of the economic challenge, attempt to understand the forces behind it, and use straightforward economic analysis along with empirical and historical evidence as we consider policy options that may help solve the problem. Economists have reached consensus on some important policy issues, but are sharply divided on others. Rather than simply identifying the best policy option, we must humbly acknowledge that there are few perfect solutions, since most economic issues involve trade-offs. Because there is uncertainty about these trade-offs, and because people just don't always see eye to eye on the appropriate goals of economic policy. We policy analysts can't act like we know it all, because we don't. And even if we did, we need to respect the autonomy of one another. On the other hand, we're not going to just throw up our hands in the air, but we will try to identify what economists see as the leading options for tackling these tough problems. Rather than asserting and defending my own preferences, I will try throughout the course to rely on results from surveys of professional economists, including one survey specially commissioned for this course, about how the economy works and which policies will be most effective. The lectures in this course focus, in fact, on the issues that these economists raise as current concerns and concerns that will be important in the future. In Lecture 3, I'll outline the list generated by a recent survey, and thereafter will address the issues that have been identified as most pressing, beginning with macroeconomic topics. Throughout the course, we'll take a close look at U.S. public policy in relationship to these pressing problems. How has the U.S. economy been doing lately? This lecture will explain, using the most important and comprehensive economic statistics available, that the American economy has been doing pretty darned well in recent years. It is the envy of the world in many ways. Economists have several very useful ways of measuring economic performance, which allow us to make historical and international comparisons. However, none of these measures is perfect, so each must be examined carefully, caveat emptor. In this lecture, we'll look primarily at three measures: unemployment, inflation, and especially GDP. Although we'll also take a peek at wages, work hours, savings rates, government budget deficits, and trade deficits. The most important and comprehensive measurement of economic performance is gross domestic product, or GDP. In the early 20th century, before economists invented the concept of GDP, people looked at a variety of narrower economic indicators, such as total steel production, the size of the wheat, corn, and cotton crop, the number of autos produced, and the total tonnage shipped by railroad. These indicators were useful, but incomplete, because they left out a lot of stuff and they double counted other things. For example, the steel was counted and then partly recounted as a component of the autos and partly recounted again in the tonnage shipped by railroads. The key breakthrough of GDP was to count everything produced in the economy, to count it only once, and to count it right. Adding together disparate things has always been a problem. You can't add apples and oranges, goes the old adage. But people and policymakers want us to add everything up, so we've got to add apples and oranges. Suppose that oranges sell for 50 cents and apples sell for 25 cents. In this case, the market tells us that people value oranges about twice as much as apples. Thus, economists say that one orange is worth 2 apples, and we can add them up using their prices as weights. This is both expedient, making it easy to add, and it makes sense if prices reflect value. Thus, one orange at 50 cents plus 2 apples worth 25 cents each equals $1 worth of total output. This, in essence, is what GDP does. Formally stated, gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a year. GDP doesn't count everything bought and sold because it doesn't want to double count. It ignores intermediate products and inputs. If a parts supplier sells a car seat to Ford, the value of the seat won't be counted in GDP because Ford will later sell a finished car, and the price of the car will include the value of the seat and all its other components. Counting the sale of the seat to Ford would double count it, so such intermediate goods are left out of GDP. Only sales of to final users are counted. Likewise, if you sell your used car to someone, this sale won't be counted in GDP because the car was produced a few years ago, and GDP only counts what's been produced in the economy this year. Finally, if Ford decides to sell extra shares of its stock, nothing happens to GDP because shares of stock aren't a good or service. Adding up all the final goods and services produced in the U.S. economy, the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis estimates that output produced in 2006 was worth about $13.3 trillion. Wow, that is a huge number. In fact, it equals about 28% of gross world product. The U.S., with less than 5% of global population, produces more than a quarter of the value of global economic output. Dividing this $13.3 trillion by the U.S. population reveals that in 2006, output, that is GDP, equaled about $44,200 per person. And since all payments for this output turned into someone's income, the average pre-tax income in the U.S. was also about $44,200. Unfortunately, GDP statistics are hard to compare from country to country, and one period to another, because prices differ from place to place and year to year. To make comparisons over time and across space, economists use real GDP, which adjusts nominal GDP for price changes or differences. For example, U.S. GDP in the year 2000 was $9.8 trillion, while it was $13.3 trillion in 2006. The 2006 figure seems a lot bigger, but prices rose gradually by about 17% over this period, and we want to strip out the effect of this inflation to compare real GDP, the underlying value of the stuff that we've produced, holding prices constant. To do this, economists deflate the $13.3 trillion nominal GDP of 2006, taking the air of inflation out of the economic balloon. Removing the 17% inflation, GDP from 2006 was worth only $11.4 trillion in year 2000 dollars. And it's this value that we should use when comparing GDP in 2000 and 2006. Removing inflation, then, the economy grew from $9.8 trillion to $11.4 trillion, not all the way to $13.3 trillion. This procedure must always be used when making GDP comparisons. So make sure that you always look at real GDP, inflation-adjusted GDP. Likewise, when making international comparisons, we've got to adjust for differences in purchasing power, what money can actually buy from one country to another. Whenever I want to adjust dollar values to strip out the effects of inflation, I go to the www.measuringworth.com website, which has a host of statistics and easy-to-use interfaces. The measuringworth.com website is run by a couple of respected economic historians, Sam Williamson and Lawrence Officer. So, how does U.S. output and income per person stack up in the grand scheme of things once we've adjusted for price changes and differences? The bottom line is that as I speak, U.S. GDP per person is at its highest level ever, and is higher than in just about any other country in the world. The most recent statistics from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, put only Luxembourg, Norway, and recent superstar Ireland a bit ahead of the U.S. Thus, the U.S. economy is approximately the highest average income per person in the world, indeed in human history. But it is likely to break its own world record next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, if recent trends continue. GDP per capita in the U.S. is much higher than in most other large developed countries. According to the IMF, in 2006, income per person in the U.S. was about 22% higher than in Canada and 24% higher than in Britain, about 1/3 higher than in Australia and Japan, and about 40% higher than in Germany, France, and Italy, and 54% higher than in the European Union as a whole. U.S. GDP per capita in 2006 was about 3.5 times higher than Russia, almost 6 times higher than in China, and nearly 12 times higher than in India. Most Americans know that we've got about the highest average economic standard of living in the world. What they seem to want is even more. So let's take a look at the rate of growth in GDP per person. In becoming the largest, most prosperous economy in the world, the U.S. has achieved an enviable record of economic growth. In some senses, it was born relatively rich and became richer and richer over time. At the time of the American Revolution, average annual incomes in the U.S. were among the highest in the world, although they were only the equivalent of about $1,250 in today's money. By the eve of the Civil War, GDP per capita was roughly $3,400. This climbed to about $6,100 in 1900, $14,300 in 1950, and $44,200 in 2006. These estimates aren't perfect, but most economic historians believe they give a fairly clear picture of economic growth. These estimates suggest that the growth of average incomes in the U.S. has actually accelerated over time. Average incomes grew about 1.2% a year from the Revolution to the Civil War, 1.5% per year between 1860 and 1900, 1.7% per year between 1900 and 1950, and 2.3% per year since 1950. While long-term growth has been incredibly persistent, the economy has had a lot of ups and downs. GDP statistics are measured quarterly. Recession, which economists define as a period in which real GDP falls for more than one quarter, was once very common in the U.S. In the period from just before the Civil War to just after World War I, for example, the economy fell into 16 separate recessions, with the average recession lasting 22 months and the average expansion lasting 27 months. We were in recession almost as often as we were expanding. Since World War II, however, recessions have become rarer and rarer, with the average downturn lasting 10 months, followed by a period of growth averaging 57 months. The granddaddy of all economic downturns was the infamous and appropriately named Great Depression, which everyone from economists to farmers to factory workers knew was a disaster. From 1929 to 1933, U.S. economic output shrank by almost 30%, and the economy underperformed for the rest of the decade. Robust rises in the standard of living returned not during World War II, throughout which consumption was held down, but with the advent of peace. Subsequently, the economy entered a golden age of unusually rapid economic growth, which lasted, with a few pauses, until about 1973. That year marks a watershed in economic history. With war in the Middle East and skyrocketing oil prices, industrialized economies around the world fell into recession and then underwent a tumultuous period of restructuring. Sustained growth returned in late 1982, and the economy then grew for 92 consecutive months, a peacetime record. After a short recession of 8 months in 1990-91, the economy began to grow again, this time expanding for 120 consecutive months, 10 solid years, a new record, before slipping into another short-lived recession of 8 months. Beginning in November 2001, the economy began another sustained expansion. Many people refer to these last three expansions as the Reagan boom, the Clinton boom, and the Bush boom, but most economists are wary about tying macroeconomic success or failure to the policies of the president who's currently in office. So don't give too much credit or blame to them. Let me close our discussion of GDP growth rates with a few benchmarks. Since 1950, the average inflation-adjusted rate of GDP growth in the U.S. has been about 3.4% per year, about 1 percentage point higher than our per capita growth rate. Thus, if you read in the newspaper that GDP is growing at about 3 or 3.5%, recognize that this is about average. 3 to 3.5 is par for the course. An unusually fast growth rate would be 4% or above. And we broke 4% in 3 years running at the height of the last boom from 1997 to 1999. A growth rate of about 2 or 2.5% is okay, but a bit on the slow side, and anything below 2% is pretty disappointing. 4% or above is great, 3% is good, 2% is fair, below 2% is weak. That's my rough rule of thumb based on recent historical trends. The difference between 2% growth and 4% growth might seem pretty trivial. And it is if the difference persists for only a quarter or two. But the difference is huge if it's sustained for a long while. To demonstrate this, let's use the rule of 72. The rule of 72 is a mathematical regularity that the number 72 divided by a growth rate equals the approximate number of years that it takes something to double. Thus, dividing our magic number 72 by 2 tells us that it takes about 36 years for an economy growing at 2% per year to double in size. or real incomes growing at 2% per year to double. On the other hand, an economy growing at 4% will double in 72 divided by 4 years. That's only 18 years. Thus, if the economy grows at 2%, it'll double in 36 years. If it grows at 4%, it'll double in 18 years and redouble in 36 years. In 36 years, it'll be twice as big as one that's growing at only 2%. In recent years, almost all the world has experienced strong economic growth. In 2006, world GDP grew by more than 5%. The Economist, the British news magazine, publishes every week a summary of the latest economic statistics from around the world. In the most recent periods, GDP has been growing in every single one of the 42 countries listed, from 2% in Japan and France, to 3% in the US and much of Europe, to 6 or 7% in South Africa, Indonesia, Russia, Poland, Pakistan, Egypt, and Colombia, to a stunning rate of almost 9% in India and over 10% in China. We'll turn to the reasons that poorer countries are able to grow faster than leaders, like the US, in the next lecture. Even though economists seem to mention GDP in every other breath, we are quick to point out the shortcomings of official GDP statistics too. GDP comparisons are hampered first and foremost by problems with accurately measuring prices, price changes, and differences, a subject to which we'll return in a few lectures. GDP has a hard time dealing with government, since the goods and services that government produces aren't usually bought and sold in the market. We're not quite sure how to value them, and we simply value them at cost. In addition, GDP omits a lot. It doesn't count output that's produced in households. For example, if you feed, tickle, wipe, and burp a baby at home, nothing is added to GDP. But if you pay somebody in a daycare center to do this, the value of this service is added to GDP. GDP estimates also omit the underground economy, purchases that occur in the market but which aren't reported to the authorities, perhaps so the IRS or some regulator won't find out. Friedrich Schneider and Dominic Enste, in a recent book, estimate that counting the shadow economy would add about 9% to official U.S. GDP. The number is even larger in other countries with higher marginal tax rates. A few countries, including Greece and Italy, have actually begun estimating the size of the underground economy and tacking this on to their official estimates. In addition, there are some gray areas, debates about whether certain items are intermediate or final goods. Physical capital, like machines, counts as a final good and is counted in GDP, but intangible capital items, such as research and development expenditures and business software, are counted as intermediate goods and aren't added to GDP. GDP leaves out a lot of other things. The value of a life, health, longevity, leisure time, environmental quality, natural resources, freedom, and justice are all omitted. This is because GDP is designed to measure the value of the stuff, that's the goods and services, that we produce. Finally, remember that GDP is a flow, a measure of how much is produced during a period of time. It's not a stock, like the stock of wealth. If an earthquake flattens a city, our stock of wealth goes down, but GDP may actually rise as we rebuild the city. We shouldn't mistake this rise in how much we're producing for a rise in well-being. And no country should simply try to maximize its GDP. Our next key economic health indicator is the unemployment rate. In calculating this rate, it's important to note that most people who aren't working are not counted as unemployed. Most non-employed people are counted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the not in the labor force category. Retirees, full-time homemakers, full-time students, and the like have no job, but they are not unemployed. To be counted as unemployed, you must be actively seeking work by contacting employers, employment agencies, or even friends and relatives about job openings. This could involve sending out resumes, filling out applications, or calling about help wanted ads. Also, workers expecting to be recalled from layoff are counted as unemployed, whether or not they've engaged in a specific job-seeking activity. The unemployment rate divides the number who are unemployed by the sum of the employed and the unemployed individuals, the total labor force. Economic historians have constructed estimates of the unemployment rate all the way back to the late 1800s. The highest unemployment rate ever recorded in the U.S. was nearly 25% in 1933, at the bottom of the Great Depression. In recent years, the unemployment rate has followed a distinct pattern, spiking up when the economy falls into a recession, plateauing or even drifting upward a bit as the economy regains its momentum, and then gradually dropping as the economy expands. And it seems to take a GDP growth rate of over 2% to get the unemployment rate to fall. The post-World War II high unemployment rate came in 1982, and the unemployment rate briefly exceeded 10%. The 1980s boom pulled this rate down to an even 5% before it spiked up to 7.8% after the 1990-91 recession. The 90s boom pulled the unemployment rate all the way down to 3.8% in April 2000, the lowest peacetime rate since 1957, although nowhere near the all-time low when unemployment fell to about 1.2% during World War II. The unemployment rate then jumped up to 6.3% following the 2001 recession, and it has since slid close to about 4%. So, how's the overall U.S. economy unemployment rate doing these days? Consider these decadal averages. In the 1960s, unemployment averaged 4.8%. This rose to 6.2% in the 70s and 7.3% in the 80s. The booming 1990s saw the unemployment rate average 5.8%. And the first decade of the new century has averaged a rate of 5.1% so far. Thus, the most recent period's unemployment rate is about the lowest of the past half century, a hair above the average for the 1960s, whose rate was pulled down by a massive military mobilization. In addition, the U.S. has been blessed with an unemployment rate considerably lower than in other industrialized countries. Our recent rate, below 5%, compares with a rate of about 7.5% in the Eurozone. Lecture 6 will return to trends in unemployment and what we can do to keep unemployment low. The third key macroeconomic measure is the inflation rate. Inflation occurs when the overall price level in the economy rises and is usually measured by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is estimated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Using survey data, the BLS constructs a basket of goods purchased by a typical household and then measures how the price of this basket changes from month to month and year to year. As always, there are debates about whether or not this official statistic does a good enough job, but we'll defer this to a later lecture. Most people don't like inflation. Anyone with assets whose value is fixed, that is, assets whose value doesn't climb with inflation, really gets burned by inflation. If someone owes you $10,000 and prices double, you get ripped off because the $10,000 now buys only half as much. If your employer has promised you a pension of $10,000 per year and prices double, you're in bad shape. Throughout most of its history, the U.S. has had a low inflation rate. But there have been important exceptions. During the Civil War, prices soared, roughly doubling in 5 years in the North and increasing 50-fold in the South. Likewise, during the Revolutionary War, the continental dollar lost almost all its value. The most recent period of high inflation was the 1970s, when inflation averaged almost 7.5% a year, and cumulatively, prices rose about 112% in 10 years. In the early 1980s, the Federal Reserve made a concerted effort to squeeze the inflation out of the economy And in recent years, inflation has been under control. In the 1990s, inflation averaged a moderate 3% per year. Since then, it's averaged about 2.6% a year. Most economists see the ideal inflation rate as about 2%, so they're pleased by these recent developments. We'll get into inflation in much greater detail in Lecture 5. To summarize our three main economic indicators, I'll fill out a macroeconomic report card. The U.S. has about the highest GDP per person in the history of the world. Let's give the economy an A+ for that. The GDP growth rate in recent decades has been somewhat above its longer-term average and above rates in other rich countries like Germany, France, and Japan, with sustained expansions that last nearly a decade. Let's give it at least a B, maybe an A for this. The U.S. unemployment rate in recent years has been among the lowest in the past half-century. It deserves at least a B for this. And finally, the inflation rate is almost exactly where we want it to be, a bit above the ideal 2%. The economy gets an A for this. We should be quite proud of our stellar student who's on the dean's list. But critics worry that these major indicators hide some serious and looming weaknesses in the economy. So let's close by briefly looking at these subjects that we'll return to in greater detail later in the course. Worry number one is wages and inequality. While average incomes have been rising strongly, wages for many people haven't been rising as strongly, especially for people at the bottom end of the income distribution. In the early 1980s, weekly pre-tax earnings of full-time workers at the top were about 3.9 times higher than at the bottom, the 10th percentile. 20 years later, this wage ratio climbed from 3.9 to 4.6. In addition, earnings inequality in the U.S. is higher than in other economically developed countries. We'll discuss inequality in greater detail in Lecture 7. Worry number two is overwork. Yes, U.S. incomes are considerably higher than the European average, but income per hour worked is closer. Average annual hours per worker is about 1,400 in France, a bit higher in Germany, 1,600 in Britain and Italy, but slightly over 1,800 in the U.S., averaging about 35 hours per week. Hours of work have been falling in other rich countries, but they haven't been in the U.S. Due to fewer hours spent in household production, leisure time has increased a bit in the U.S. over the past few decades, except among those at the top of the income distribution. But European leisure time has exploded. Worry number three is government budget deficits. The federal government began running sizable deficits, spending more than it earned in the 1970s. These deficits climbed in the 80s, but were erased by the end of the booming 90s, with 3 years of surpluses. However, the deficits have returned, worrying many, a topic that we'll dissect in Lecture 10. Worry number four is lower savings rates. Personal savings rates in the U.S. plummeted during the 1980s and 90s and became negative in 2005. Are we on a consumption binge? The low savings rate is tied to worry number five, our surging trade deficits. Since about 1980, the U.S. has spent more on imports than it earns on exports, causing the U.S.'s net international investment position to turn negative. The gap has surged in recent years. In 2005, this international deficit reached an unprecedented 6% of GDP. We'll take up these related concerns in Lecture 9. I believe that our overall economic picture has been very bright and has gotten brighter and brighter over the past quarter century, so I don't want to overstate these worries. In our next lecture, we will look to the future. Again, we'll see that most economists are very optimistic, although not Pollyannas. In that lecture, we'll use survey evidence to examine which economic trends concerned economists the most. Our last lecture showed that recent economic performance in the United States and much of the rest of the world has been very strong, according to the most important indicators. The U.S. economy has been blessed by low unemployment rates, low inflation rates, and solid rates of real GDP growth. Now we turn to what the future will bring, a hotly contested subject. Some disciplines are increasingly pessimistic about the future. For example, in the 2005 bestseller, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, Jared Diamond confronts the reader with stories of the collapse and even extinction of past societies. Ultimately, he claims to be a cautious optimist about the future, but he still sees a strong likelihood that globally we are headed into decline. Are we likely to live out such a scenario? Diamond identifies 8 environmental threats that undermined societies in the past, exacting calamity upon our ancestors, and warns that modern societies have added 4 additional problems, including global climate change and energy shortages. Diamond writes, most of the 12 threats, it is claimed, will become globally critical within the next few decades. Either we solve the problems by then, or the problems will undermine first world societies. Much more likely than a doomsday scenario involving human extinction or an apocalyptic collapse of industrial civilization would be just a future of significantly lower living standards. If the history of the economics profession were a sufficient guide, Diamond would be swiftly inducted into the Economics Honor Society, Omicron Delta Epsilon, and solemnly welcomed to the professional fraternity. After all, historically, economists have been a fairly pessimistic group. The moniker the dismal science surely stuck for such a long time because so many economists followed the lead of Thomas Malthus in predicting that population growth, in the face of resource constraints, would inevitably squelch hopes for a broad-based rise in standards of living. Most of the world's economic history up to the time of Malthus was fairly gloomy. Standards of living for most people were abysmally low. Life expectancies were short, people were malnourished and stunted by today's standards. Discoveries and institutional adaptations brought slow population growth, but the long-term growth rate of income per capita was essentially zero. Let's briefly examine the Malthusian model in economic terms. The model focuses on the supply and demand for labor and applies best to a period in which almost everyone earns their living directly from the land, as a hunter-gatherer or more likely in agriculture. The demand for labor, the amount that an employer or the earth itself is willing to pay, is tied to the worker's productivity. However, there's a fixed amount of resources to go around. For example, a fixed amount of land for the worker to till, and a fixed amount of tools he can use, such as plows or oxen to pull the plows. As more workers are employed, the productivity of the additional worker, his marginal productivity, eventually falls because he has fewer resources to use. The first worker put onto a 5-acre plot of land produces a lot. The second worker produces less. Additional workers produce less and less because the most important tasks will already have been done by the first workers, and additional labor is needed only for increasingly unproductive tasks. Weeding for the 4th time, shooing away crows, gleaning the small amount of crops that have been spilled at harvest time, etc. This phenomenon is known as the law of diminishing marginal returns, the infamous law of diminishing returns. Thus, when more workers are crowded into one space, the average output per worker falls, as does the marginal product and the wage or other payment. In the strictest Malthusian model, the wage is driven down to the subsistence rate, the rate at which the standard of living is so low that the overall birth rate must be equal to the overall death rate. The wage can temporarily rise above the subsistence rate, but the iron law of wages describes why it cannot permanently rise higher. Suppose this society makes a breakthrough. They discover a new crop that can be planted in previously unused land, or they develop a new tool. This will boost their productivity, driving their wages above the subsistence. They will live high on the hog for a while. But at the higher wage rate, they become more fecund, pushing the birth rate up. And they're better nourished and less susceptible to disease, pushing the death rate down. Thus, the population inexorably begins to grow. And as it does, the wage rate gets pushed down until we're back where we started, with wages so low that the birth rate equals the death rate again. Malthus wasn't quite this pessimistic, pointing to societal forces that held population growth in check, such as delaying marriage. But even under these circumstances, productivity improvements are followed by enough population growth to push the standard of living back down to its low starting level, if not all the way down to subsistence. Right around the time that Malthus explained this model, it began to become a less and less accurate reflection of reality. The first important factor shortcutting its iron law of wages was that the stream of technological productivity improvements began to swell into a river. The demand curve for labor began to shift out so quickly that even an acceleration in population growth couldn't pull down wages. Second, the link between higher wages and higher birth rates broke down. As people moved out of agriculture, the desire to have large families began to diminish. One key was that the relative wage of women climbed in comparison to men. Around 1800, the average wage of women in the northern U.S., for example, was very low in comparison to men. Agricultural work such as plowing and harvesting grains, cutting hay and caring for livestock relied fairly heavily on upper body strength, and men generally have a lot more of this than women. For example, in Massachusetts in 1815, the average female wage was about 29% of the average male wage. Because this relative wage was so low, the opportunity cost of bearing and raising a child was very low. Let's set the husband's income at $1 per unit of time and the wife's at 29 cents. If she bears children instead of making and selling output, their collective income, according to this calculation, falls from $1.29 to $1. They give up less than a quarter of their income. A generation later, the relative wage of women in the northern U.S. was considerably higher. Manufacturing jobs were now available, and women's relative productivity was much higher. As steam engines and water mills provided much of the power, productivity was linked more and more to manual dexterity and much less to muscle power. Average wages of women in manufacturing were about half of those of men. Again, let's set the husband's income at $1 per unit of time, and the wife's is now 50 cents. If she bears children instead of making and selling output, their collective income, according to this calculation, falls from $1.50 to $1. They give up a third of their income if she raises children rather than working for pay. In recent years, productivity is related less to muscle power and more to brain power, something that men and women possess much more equally, pushing women's wages towards equality with men's. In this case, about half the couple's income is given up if she decides to forego paid work for raising children. The bottom line is that the rising relative wages of women have made the opportunity cost of raising children soar, helping reduce fertility rates and undoing the Malthusian mechanism. Oddly, economist pessimism continued even after modern economic growth kicked in, bringing unmistakable evidence of rising incomes to people in Europe and North America by at least the middle of the 1800s. As Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets pointed out, throughout the 1800s, most American economists continued this unwarranted gloom. The economist of the 1850s wrote, right after the gold rush and the adoption of steam engines and the building of thousands of miles of railroads, that the progress of the last decade had been so great that it could not possibly continue. Yet it did. An economist at the end of the 19th century wrote that the progress of the last half-century has been so great that it could not possibly continue during the 20th century. In fact, it accelerated. The naysaying continued well into the 20th century. Nobel laureate Robert Fogel shows that forecasts of economic growth from World War II through the 1950s were too pessimistic as well. However, amid a flurry of academic worries about secular stagnation, the U.S. economy charged ahead, with GDP eventually expanding more than five-fold from 1950 to the end of the century, despite a few bumps along the way. Today, however, there are strong indications that the gloom among economists has evaporated. The evidence of more than 2 centuries of burgeoning economic growth is hard to refute, and economists seem to have revised their expectations and models in light of these facts. Economic histories now bear titles like Growth Triumphant. A history of global investment in the 20th century is titled Triumph of the Optimists. And introductory textbooks work through Paul Romer's New Growth Theory, forecasting unchecked economic growth and likening the economy to a perpetual motion machine. Do today's economists think this economic growth will continue and spread in the future? Is it really time to rename economics the cheerful science? The answer to these questions requires a broad-based assessment of economists, rather than anecdotes. Accordingly, in late 2005, I surveyed members of the American Economic Association. I found that economists are very optimistic about the future growth of the American economy. One survey question asked about growth over the next decade. The largest group, 49%, expects per capita income in the U.S. to slow down just a bit. And almost as many, 40%, expect it to grow at about the same pace. No one expects economic decline in the coming decade. As we learned in the last lecture, in recent years the U.S. economy has grown at an unusually rapid pace. In the 10 years preceding the period in which the surveys were completed, real per capita income in the U.S. grew at about 2.4 to 2.5% a year, noticeably higher than the average of the past 30 years or so. The next survey question asked about prospects for economic growth over the next 60 years. Responses showed that economists predict that strong economic growth will continue into the foreseeable future. Almost half, 49%, forecast a growth rate that is equal to or greater than in the past 60 years. The median prediction is for per capita income in the U.S. to grow ever so slightly less than the rate over the past 60 years. And only a single economist predicts decline over the next 60 years. Now, over the past 60 years, real inflation-adjusted income per person has increased by about 2% per year, reaching $44,200 in 2006. If real per capita income continues to grow at this rate, as many economists expect, incomes will grow more than threefold in the next 60 years. Average incomes would equal approximately $147,000 in today's dollars. If the growth rate slips slightly to 1.8% per annum, incomes would approximately triple, rising to only $134,000. By the way, you can probably almost do these calculations in your head by using that handy rule of 72, which you'll recall from the last lecture, is the mathematical regularity that says you can find the approximate number of years it takes something to double by dividing 72 by the growth rate. Assuming a growth rate of 1.8%, 72 divided by 1.8 is a nice even 40. Thus, a growth rate of 1.8% will double incomes in 40 years, and in 60 years, it'll triple them. The survey's next response shows that economists believe that the U.S. will continue to be one of the richest countries in the world 60 years from now. 28% predict that the U.S. will have the highest per capita income in the world in 2065. The largest group, 71%, expects the U.S. to be not the highest, but in the top tier. And only a single pessimist predicts that the U.S. will fall from the top tier of countries. Now, staying in the top tier will become harder to do because economists expect that within the next couple of generations, many, and perhaps most, countries and regions that are currently poor and economically underdeveloped will achieve standards of living equaling or surpassing today's level in the richest countries. The survey asked, 60 years from now, what countries or regions, if any, will have joined the group of developed nations with an income per capita approximately equaling or surpassing today's level in the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, and Western Europe. Of those who answered the question, 62% put China on the list, with another 5% rating it a maybe. 2/3 mentioned other places in East Asia, especially South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Thailand. 33% mentioned India. 40% put all or parts of Latin America on the list, with Chile mentioned most frequently, followed by Brazil and Mexico. And 37% listed all or parts of Eastern Europe. The power of compounding is indeed awesome. The International Monetary Fund gives China's 2005 income per capita as $7,200. If China were to maintain its recent 10% per year growth rate for a mere 18 and a half years, it would reach $41,400, catching up to the U.S. level of 2005. India would need to grow at 10% a year for 26 and a half years to catch up. Now, maintaining such a blistering pace for this long won't be easy, especially since it's harder to catch up the closer you get to the lead. Much of the catch-up growth in poorer countries involves moving people out of relatively unproductive sectors, such as traditional non-mechanized agriculture, into more productive sectors like manufacturing. Much of the catch-up is driven by the huge productivity gains that occur when first-world technology and organizational techniques are moved directly to poorer countries. This kind of catch-up can't continue forever. As more and more of the once underdeveloped country's economy adopts modern methods, the opportunity to catch up disappears. However, it should be pointed out that China could catch up to the U.S. level of 2005 in 60 years, even if its growth rate fell to a mere 3%. The next survey question asked, 60 years from now, what countries or regions, if any, will have high levels of absolute poverty? That is, 20% or more of the population living on an income of $2 a day or less in 1985 dollars. This kind of awful absolute poverty is widespread in the world's poorest countries. One authority estimates that in 1998, the percentage of people living on $2 or less per day was about 64% in Africa, 16% in Asia, and 10% in Latin America. Greater than 20% of the population of every African country listed except Mauritius, Botswana, Gabon, Guinea, and South Africa lived on $2 per day or less. The figure reached 89% in Tanzania, 82% in Ethiopia, 70% in Nigeria, and 63% in Kenya, for example. Sadly, most economists expect all or most of sub-Saharan Africa to remain poor. Among those who answered the survey question, 94% believe that all or parts of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, will continue to have high rates of absolute poverty, 20% or more living on $2 per day or less, 60 years from now. Several respondents specifically exempted South Africa from the list. The reasons for this pessimism about Africa and what we should do about it will be the subject of a future lecture. The bottom line, however, is that most economists are very optimistic about the economic future of almost all the world. it seems that economics has become the cheerful science. The Malthusian model has a powerful logic. Crowd more and more people onto a planet with limited resources, and their standard of living will be driven down. Modern Malthusians add an additional wrinkle. They say that we're living on borrowed time, using up resources now so that our descendants won't have as many, befouling the environment so that we'll leave it unusable for future generations. How do these optimistic economists sidestep these concerns? I'll address this question in greater detail in a future lecture, but for now, let me outline the economist's vision of the perpetual growth machine. Data on economic inputs, such as the labor force, capital stock, and raw materials, can be used by economists along with data on GDP to estimate the proximate sources of economic growth. These growth accounting studies generally conclude that the primary source of economic growth in rich countries like the United States isn't investment in larger and larger capital stock or our ever-growing supply of other inputs. Rather, the chief source of economic growth is rising levels of what's called total factor productivity, essentially our ability to get more and more with the same inputs. Even if our capital stock per worker wasn't growing, our economy would be growing because of these advances in technology and organization. The new growth theory focuses on a supply and demand for this new technology and new knowledge. At one point in history, the demand for new ideas in most places was pretty low. New knowledge was often greeted with suspicion. We've been planting this same set of crops for centuries. Growing this new crop from a strange place is risky, and it'll require us to make a lot of changes about how we organize things, skeptics would say. Bringing these new machines into our town? It might put us all out of a job, worried workers, who were sometimes ready to smash the machines in Luddite fashion if they were too threatening. Bringing in these new ideas will increase the power of our rivals, those in power might worry. These new ideas will undermine our traditional hierarchy and cultural beliefs. We'd better steer clear of them, said many of the most powerful people in society. Under these conditions, the demand for new ideas was often pretty small. Simultaneously, the supply of new ideas was pretty small. The payoff to the innovator from the ideas was likely to be small, so he or she had little incentive to take time away from grubbing out a living to innovate. The supply was also small because education levels were so low. Then, as the modern era opened, the scientific revolution occurred. Scientists and developers of new technology developed methods to communicate with each other through journals and standardized terminology and measurements. The scientific method showed how to do controlled experiments, holding everything else constant to isolate cause and effect. Education levels rose. The supply of new ideas swelled. On the demand side, patents were issued, increasing the financial payoff from innovation. Markets and economies of scale grew, meaning that products made with a new invention could be sold globally, not just locally. Attitudes changed, and innovators became cultural heroes, regaled with Nobel Prizes and the like. These changes led to a torrent of new ideas, from the steam engine to electricity, industrial chemicals, the internal combustion engine, computers, and biotechnology. In a nutshell, the key economic change was that the rate of return on the investment in innovation climbed from being fairly low to being high enough to equal or surpass the rate of return on other traditional investments in land and machines. The new growth theory points out that discoveries are not random, but come from choices driven by incentives. And we've given innovators huge incentives. If you come up with a great innovation, you'll probably earn a basket full of money. But you won't earn it forever because someone else will come up with an even better idea which steals away your customers. Entrepreneurs only earn big profits if they're one step ahead of the competition. So we've set our best minds up in a race to come up with better and better ideas. The key difference between ideas, or knowledge capital, and traditional capital like machines and buildings is that knowledge capital is a public good. Unlike a single machine, a single idea can be used simultaneously all over the world by everyone. In addition, knowledge capital doesn't suffer from the law of diminishing marginal returns. If you put more and more workers into a setting where everything else is constant, the last worker has less and less to do and is less and less productive. Likewise, if you put more and more machines into a setting where everything else is constant, the last machine has less and less to do and is less and less productive. But ideas are different. If you put more and more ideas into a setting where everything else is constant, the new ideas needn't be less productive than the previous ideas. Just because nanotechnology followed the domestication of plants and animals, metallurgy, steam power, electricity, and computers, doesn't mean that it must be less productive than them. In fact, new ideas build on old ideas with often spectacular complementarities. Economists seem to have embraced the logic of this new growth theory. They believe we've collectively turned on a knowledge-producing machine which gives massive incentives to people to come up with better and better ideas. And it doesn't look like we'll shut it down anytime soon. In fact, as there are more and more people around the world to come up with new ideas, and because worldwide education levels are climbing, the pace of technological innovation is likely to accelerate over time. Economist Julian Simon argues that the ultimate resource, the title of one of his books, is people. He and others go so far as to turn Malthus on his head. More people doesn't so much mean more mouths to feed, it means more minds to think and solve problems. More people actually raise standards of living in the long run, says this theory, which some economists embrace. The glowing optimism of mainstream economists doesn't mean they have no concerns about the future. If they didn't, this course would end here and now. The final two questions on the survey asked, what will be the three most important economic challenges facing the United States over the next 10 years? And what will be the three most important economic challenges facing the United States over the next 60 years? According to these economists, the most important economic challenges the U.S. economy is likely to face in the next decade are tied to, first, aging Social Security and pensions. Second, health care and health insurance, including Medicare and Medicaid. Third, trade imbalances and globalization. Fourth, federal budget deficits and the debt. Tied for fifth, educational inadequacies and energy. Tied for seventh, government regulation and terrorism, war, and military spending. Others mentioned by more than 3 people in the survey included low savings, infrastructure, immigration, and inequality. The most important challenges foreseen over the next 60 years are very similar. Economists see the top challenges for our children and grandchildren being tied to, in descending order, first, aging, Social Security, and pensions. Second, health care and insurance. Tied for third, education and trade and globalization. And sustaining productivity growth. Sixth, energy. Seventh, terrorism, war, and military spending. Eighth, the environment. Only 3 specifically mention global warming. Ninth, government regulation. And 10th, inequality. Others mentioned by more than 3 people included federal budget deficits and debt, immigration, low savings, and infrastructure. As these results show, most economists aren't wary that we'll run out of resources or hopelessly wreck the environment, crippling economic growth in a Malthusian fashion. I developed the survey in anticipation of jointly teaching a seminar modestly titled The Future of Humanity with two colleagues from biology. And what struck us and our students is the paucity of references to concerns about the environment and resources, as emphasized in books like Jared Diamond's Collapse. Instead, many of the challenges listed by these economists concern dimensions of the economy where complicated government programs play a large role. For example, pensions, medical care, and education. Or where government attempts to solve problems are identified as the source of the difficulty. For example, budget deficits and misregulation. We will now turn to this set of concerns about the present and the future. Our next lecture concerns the third greatest concern on the list of long-range concerns: what we should do about productivity growth. As our last two lectures have explained, the American economy has grown a lot in the past, and economists expect the American economy to grow a lot in the future. It is productivity growth, producing more output per hour of work, that's the key to this economic growth. This lecture will begin by examining the basic channels through which productivity can grow, using the example of farming. Next, we'll look at trends in American productivity growth, examining reasons that it slid beginning in the 1970s and rebounded in the 1990s. We'll explore the sources of recent productivity growth, relating it not only to technology, but to broader economic, institutional, and cultural conditions, and what economists call creative destruction, by comparing the recent productivity surge in the U.S. versus weaker performance in Europe. We'll close by asking the policymakers' question: what should we do about productivity growth? How can we boost it? Is it worth the trouble? What is productivity? Productivity, or more technically, labor productivity, simply equals total output produced per hour of labor. This sounds easy to compute, but it can be difficult in practice because sometimes it's hard to measure output. For example, is a doctor's output the number of patients seen? Easy to measure. Or the number of patients cured? Probably closer to what we want, but much harder to measure. Also, the concept of an hour of labor can be slippery, since not every hour of labor, nor every worker, is equal. Consider a farm that grows corn. The farmer produces only corn and at the end of the year harvests 2,000 ears. If he worked for 500 hours during the year, this works out to a productivity of 2,000 ears divided by 500 hours, or 4 ears per hour. We don't like to measure productivity in ears of corn, or haircuts, or widgets, or heart transplants, or oil changes per hour, however, because this makes comparisons from industry to industry pretty tough. Accordingly, let's say that the corn sells for 25 cents per ear. In this case, the farmer's productivity of 4 ears per hour equals only $1 per hour. How can this farmer increase this low level of productivity? Anything that boosts the amount or value of output or cuts the amount of labor needed per ear of corn will do the trick. There are essentially 3 ways to boost productivity: more inputs, better inputs, and better use of inputs. First, let's consider more inputs. Our farmer has been plowing his field with 1 mule. If he used 2 mules, he could get the job done in only 400 hours. That's 5 ears per hour rather than 4 ears per hour, so productivity has risen 25%. If he used more of some other input, say fertilizer, more of the crop would grow, boosting productivity. Adding more labor increases output, but it doesn't usually boost productivity because the increase in output is smaller than the increase in labor. This is because the amount of tools, such as mules per worker, has gone down when we increase only labor, making each worker less productive. This is that law of diminishing marginal returns that we saw last lecture. Economists generally refer to tools, be they physical tools, machines, vehicles, buildings, computers, or even work animals like mules, as capital. The second way to increase labor productivity is to use better inputs. If he traded in his mules for a tractor, he might be able to produce 10 times as much corn per hour. If his land was simply more fertile, he'd get more corn per hour. If he used better pesticides, herbicides, or genetically modified seeds, the corn plants would yield more, boosting productivity. Inputs and output can be improved in a lot of different dimensions. If scientists develop a new variety of seeds that yields tastier corn, people will be willing to pay more for it. So the value of his output per hour, that is his productivity, will rise. Finally, if he switches to a completely new crop that's more valuable per hour of labor, up goes productivity. The farmer is one of the inputs himself. So if he takes an extension course on the best methods of corn production, or a light bulb simply goes off over his head, and he figures out some new ways to save time and other resources, his productivity will jump as he's able to use his inputs better. This ability to get more output from the same inputs is called total factor productivity growth. And it is ultimately the key to almost all growth in labor productivity. Notice that the line between more inputs, and better use of inputs is sometimes fuzzy. For example, switching from a mule to a tractor is more inputs, since the tractor costs more, but the tractor is also better because it's more productive per dollar spent. As the farmer gains wisdom and experience, he'll be a better input, and at the same time, will use other inputs better. I chose an agricultural example because it can easily illustrate the factors at work in productivity growth, but also because agricultural productivity has grown tremendously over the past century and has been studied quite extensively. Around 1910, American farmers produced about 3/4 of a bushel of corn per hour of work. By World War II, this climbed to 1¼ bushels per hour. By the early 1960s, it was 9 bushels per hour, hitting 33 bushels per hour in the early 1980s. In 70 years, labor productivity in corn farming rose 45-fold. That's simply amazing. Over the same stretch, productivity rose about 23-fold for wheat, 19-fold for milk, 10-fold for eggs, and 4.5-fold for beef. Because of these tremendous productivity increases, overall farm output increased a little more than 3-fold between 1910 and 1990, faster than overall population growth. But farm labor actually fell to about 1/6 of its original level, and the amount of real estate used in farming actually dropped a bit too. How could output rise while labor fell and land stayed the same? Other inputs rose. The value of machinery quadrupled, and the value of chemicals skyrocketed. Plus, these 4 inputs were used in new, better ways so that total factor productivity, the ability to get output from inputs, roughly tripled. To figure out the sources of productivity growth, economists examine data like these very carefully. They usually model the economy, or a sector of the economy, as one giant mathematical equation. On the left side of the equation is output, or value of output, and on the right side is a complex function showing how the varied inputs, especially labor, capital, land, and raw materials, interact to produce output. We don't know exactly how these inputs interact, so we use a pretty flexible mathematical formula such as the Cobb-Douglas production function, which takes each input, raises it to an exponential power, multiplies them together, and then multiplies the whole function by a constant representing the total factor productivity. Next, the researcher measures the rate of change of output and each of the inputs and uses observational data to estimate how much output increases whenever each of the inputs rises by 1%, holding everything else constant. Over the years, economists doing this have found some consistent regularities. For example, one useful rule of thumb is that for the U.S. economy as a whole, any increase of capital will yield an increase in total output that's about 1/3 as big in percentage terms. This responsiveness rate of 1/3 is known as the output elasticity. This 1/3 rule implies that if the U.S. increases its capital stock by, say, 30%, our output, or real GDP, would rise by 1/3 as much. That is 10%. What we cannot measure directly is the mysterious total factor productivity, our ability to squeeze output from a given set of inputs. But if we measure everything else correctly, output, inputs, and elasticities, we can deduce increases in total factor productivity. Since measuring output, inputs, and elasticities is fraught with difficulty, estimates of total factor productivity growth are sometimes a little bit iffy. This all sounds a bit complicated, I know, and it is, but economists who generate these estimates seem to be in consensus about the sources of American productivity growth. Back in the 1800s, the major source of our productivity growth was a rising level of capital. Since then, our major sources of economic growth have been increases in total factor productivity, because we know more, have unlocked the secrets of nature, and have figured out how to organize and do things better, squeezing more output from our inputs. I'm of the opinion that we humans have an innate, perhaps God-given desire and ability to learn more of nature's secrets. And we certainly have learned how to squeeze more and more outputs from the resources that creation has endowed us with. Total factor productivity improvements have explained roughly 3/4 of American productivity growth in recent decades, meaning that increases in capital explain the other quarter. Sometimes total factor productivity growth is equated with technological improvements, but TFP growth encompasses much more than simply an advance in technology. It involves how people configure and apply technology as well. Let's take a look at historical labor productivity growth in the U.S. and Western Europe. In the 1800s, the U.S. pulled ahead of Europe in productivity, and it widened its lead in the first half of the 20th century while Europeans warred with one another. In 1950, U.S. productivity was more than twice as high as Europe's. Then Europe began to catch up rapidly to the U.S. The reason seems pretty clear. Europeans had a backlog of inventions and innovations to incorporate into their economies. U.S. productivity grew at almost its fastest pace ever from 1950 to 1973, about 2.7% a year, but European productivity grew at an amazing 4.7% as part of the post-war catch-up miracle. This miracle, say most economists, was a stable environment into which new technology, much of it already in place in the U.S., could be incorporated. Then a wheel fell off the cart after 1973. Productivity growth in the U.S. fell to 1.5% a year from 1973 to 1995, and it slowed to 2.2% per year in Europe. Europe's catch-up slowed, but by 1995, productivity in Europe was only a little behind that in the U.S. Europe almost pulled even, only 6% or so behind the U.S. And during much of this period, Japan continued its rapid catch-up, closing in on both the U.S. and Europe. Amid a lot of hand-wringing, it looked like some of these rivals would overtake the U.S. People were especially concerned during the 1980s that surging Japan would leave the U.S. in the dust. Remember in the movie Back to the Future when Marty McFly goes back to from the 1980s to the 1950s and informs an amazed Doc Brown that all the best stuff is made in Japan? Well, right after this, the Japanese economy went into a swoon. And then in the mid-1990s, the American economy shifted back into high gear. Productivity growth jumped back to about its historical level, rising 2.5% per year from 1995 to 2000, and then above its historical pace, hitting 3.1% per year between 2000 and 2005. Surprisingly, European productivity growth rates fell, and America's productivity lead over Europe reopened, reaching about 18% by 2003. What explains the slowdown that began in 1973? And what explains the divergence between the U.S. and Europe since 1995? Productivity growth is a very mysterious and opaque phenomenon in many ways. But here are the major factors that economic analysts see as important. The big productivity growth slowdown occurred exactly when the price of energy soared in the wake of the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo, followed several years later by an even bigger oil price spike at the time of the Iranian Revolution and high prices during much of the Iran-Iraq War. William Nordhaus's research concludes that 2/3 of the productivity slowdown occurred in industries directly affected by the 1970s energy crisis, such as pipelines, utilities, motor vehicles, and air transportation. He concludes that the energy shocks were the earthquake, and the industries with the largest slowdown were nearest the epicenter of the tectonic shifts in the economy. But the energy shocks alone cannot explain the productivity slowdown because it lasted long after energy prices came back down in the mid-1980s. Another culprit may be that the U.S., as the technological leader, had simply used up the major gains that could be extracted from a series of technological breakthroughs in the early part of the 20th century. Earlier in the century, electricity revolutionized manufacturing by decentralizing the source of power and making possible flexible and portable tools and machines, eliminating the need for expensive steam engines with their belt and shaft technology and the need to build long, narrow factories which didn't accommodate the throughput of materials and finished products. By 1973, electric motors had long been embodied in these machines and in productivity-boosting appliances like washing machines, refrigerators, and especially air conditioning, which spurred economic development in the southern U.S., whose productivity had lagged considerably behind the rest of the nation. Earlier in the century, the internal combustion engine, which made possible personal autos, trucking, and air transport, had been perfected, so that after 1973, there just weren't as many breakthroughs to make in this technology either. Likewise, earlier in the century, the ability to rearrange molecules via petrochemicals and plastics had created great productivity strides. But by 1973, the greatest strides had been made, and additional innovations would be shorter steps in comparison. What then caused the productivity uptick in the mid-1990s? Most observers point to a new wave of technological breakthroughs that delivered radical new changes. Breakthroughs tied to electronics, microchips, and information technology. The computer arrived on the scene long before 1995. I've been using a personal computer since about 1984. But like electricity, it seemed that it took us a while to figure out how to use computers to really boost productivity. Writing in 1987, Nobel laureate and growth theorist Robert Solow famously remarked that you can see the computer revolution everywhere, except in the productivity data. So, how did the U.S. harness the productivity of the computer, and why did productivity growth slow in much of Europe at the same time? American firms found that harnessing the computer required numerous complementary changes and adaptations. They also found that firms which made these adaptations could earn big profits, while those that didn't were severely hampered and were even driven out of business. Firms are essentially forced to adopt productivity-enhancing innovations and technology if markets are competitive and flexible, as they are in the U.S. Those who conceptualize and then implement the changes necessary to harness the new technology and who dream up new ways to boost demand are entrepreneurs, whose organizational skills and risk-taking are vital to improving productivity. In a competitive environment, entrepreneurs only earn big profits if they're one step ahead of the competition, who are bound to copy them and try to outdo them. Competition and the rewards from successful competition set our best minds up in a race to come up with and implement better and better ideas. This dynamic has been around for a long time, and its chief exponent, mid-20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter, aptly called it creative destruction. A consensus seems to be emerging among economists that American institutions and social choices encourage and promote creative destruction more than those in other places, and that its financial markets welcome innovation more than elsewhere. National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, papers by economists like Robert Gordon, Martin Feldstein, and Nobel laureate Edmund Phelps spell out these differences between Europe and America. Gordon points to what he calls fundamental American advantages in fostering and exploiting innovation. The European system, on the other hand, emphasizes a corporatism that dampens competition and inhibits the entry of new firms and players into a market. Business turnover, even among the biggest businesses, is crucial for productivity growth. International data suggests that the disappearance and shrinkage of relatively unproductive big, old firms, such as U.S. Steel, has as much to do with productivity growth as the arrival of newer, nimbler rivals. Turning the mid-20th century adage on its head, what's good for GM is not necessarily good for America. In the U.S., little is done to protect flagging big businesses. Data indicate that the productivity growth acceleration in the U.S. has been centered in the information and communications technology, ICT, producing and using sectors, with the chief ICT using sectors being retail, wholesale, and finance. Let's take a look at retail. In this industry, more productive newcomers in the U.S. have displaced much less productive existing establishments. Firms like Walmart, Sam's Club, Costco, Home Depot, Best Buy, and Circuit City aren't just big, they combine bigness with new, efficient design that allows large volume unloading from delivery trucks and stacking of merchandise with forklifts. They've developed computerized systems that allow them to track inventory, automatically reorder, bill and accept payments, and then analyze sales patterns. This computerized flow of information also allows their suppliers to smooth out production and makes it more manageable to increase product variety. European firms have the same technologies at their disposal, but they face greater impediments to utilizing them, including land use restrictions, shop closing time regulations, a population that uses mass transit, and restrictive labor rules. In fact, some of these innovative American companies have tried to use their methods in Europe, but haven't found high profits, partly for these very reasons. In addition, some European countries, producers, refuse to offer volume discounts to new, high-volume retailers in order to protect their core customers who are smaller, high-cost merchants. Phelps argues that many European countries, especially those in the heart of Europe, like Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, see their productivity growth retarded almost on purpose by corporatist institutions which are designed to protect incumbent producers and inhibit new entry. Among these impediments include complicated licenses and permissions needed to set up new plants or businesses, and the necessity of consulting with workers and unions on major changes in the firm's activities, methods, and products. These policies seem specifically designed to dampen the changes inherent in unbridled capitalism. Gordon identifies a litany of other productivity-enhancing advantages the U.S. has over Europe, including 1. A unified market, not hobbled by differences in customs and language. 2. The system of peer review and meritocracy that guides U.S. government support of research. Indeed, this meritocracy and anti-elitism seems to pervade American society and has been one of its hallmarks since the beginning. 3. A dynamic capital market, especially the venture capital market that is adept at finding and funding promising startups. 4th, the welcome, due to our open society, extended to foreign graduate students and highly skilled immigrant engineers, especially from Asia, plus the serendipitous fact that English has become the language spoken by the world's educated population. And 5th, a competitive rather than ossified and hierarchical U.S. system of public and private universities. Was it a coincidence that Silicon Valley arose next to Stanford University? That hardware, software, and biotech industries are located in the Boston area around MIT and Harvard? That North Carolina's Research Triangle Park sits between UNC, NC State, and Duke? Or that Austin, Texas has turned into a high-tech hotspot? Probably not. And the list could be easily extended. If these are actually the key American advantages in spurring the latest wave in the productivity boom, why haven't others copied them? Actually, others have copied some of them. They cannot easily copy others. Changing a culture is hard. Abandoning your language is harder still. But it may be that those in other countries don't want to copy all of these features that seem to boost productivity growth in the U.S. Creative destruction is both creative and destructive. It's not always a pretty picture, especially if you're on the destruction end of things. So, what should we do about productivity growth? A smug reply might be that we should keep doing whatever we've been doing because it seems to be working. This has some truth in it. But there are many industries, like autos, and sectors in which the U.S. isn't in the forefront, and there's always the worry that our current productivity surge might soon end. Although 62% of economists in a recent survey said they believe that the U.S. has entered a new industrial revolution in which higher rates of economic growth can be maintained. Another reply is that the European system is better, and we should move toward it. The core continental European countries grow somewhat slower than the U.S., but they are at a pretty darn high standard of living. Who needs the destruction part of creative destruction? The economy isn't a foot race. You don't need a gold medal. Silver or even bronze is fine. Who cares if somebody's a bit ahead of you? Stop being so envious of others and so materialistic. This reply doesn't seem to appeal to most Americans, but it also ignores some real problems in Europe. For example, despite corporatist protections against the market free-for-all, unemployment rates are much higher in most of Europe than in the U.S., a subject we'll return to in a couple lectures. If neither of these answers appeals to you, the question becomes, what should we do to further increase and encourage productivity growth and make sure that it doesn't lag? Yes, we already give people huge payoffs, both in terms of money and prestige, for advancing productivity. What else should we do? Since productivity gains create positive spillover effects to society at large, almost any economist would encourage government action that is likely to enhance productivity growth. Here are the tactics that economists generally recommend. Tactic 1. In a recent survey, 85% of economists agreed that appropriately designed fiscal policy can increase the long-run rate of capital formation. The leading candidates are reducing tax rates on investment returns, such as cutting capital gains and dividends taxes, Indeed, 61% of economists agreed that reducing the tax rate on income from capital gains would encourage investment and promote economic growth. However, one criticism of this is that it may further increase economic inequality. Tactic 2, strengthening education. Productivity growth in much of the 20th century was aided and abetted by rising levels of education. But this has played a much smaller role recently. This is the first generation of American-born men who don't have substantially more education than their father's generation. Average years of schooling for men have plateaued with a slight upward drift between 13 and 14 years for those born after 1940. The U.S. once had a huge educational lead over other countries, but now Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Japan, South Korea, and Sweden have surpassed it in terms of 25 to 34-year-olds with college degrees. We'll return to what we can do about the high cost of higher education in a later lecture. If we really want to boost productivity, we probably need to redirect the educational system to encourage more studying of math, science, and engineering. 25% of college-educated workers in science and engineering occupations in the U.S. are foreign-born, which includes a majority of PhD holders in computer science, electrical, civil, and mechanical engineering. Many argue that immigration policy should be amended to encourage more highly educated immigrants. Tactic 3, subsidizing innovation. The ultimate source of productivity growth is innovation. So the question is, what can we do to further encourage innovation? The U.S. government already encourages innovation through direct support of research and development, or R&D, through tax credits for industry R&D, and through subsidizing the education of scientists and engineers, and of course by granting patents. Critics say that it could do more, especially in direct support. Expenditures on research and development in the U.S. have fluctuated around 2.5% of GDP over the last few decades, and the National Science Foundation reports that this is fifth among the developed countries of the world, trailing only Sweden, Finland, Japan, and Iceland. However, while the share of R&D done by business is rising, government's R&D as a share of GDP has fallen. Part of this drop reflects the end of the Cold War, but some worry that government is not doing enough to support the most basic research, which makes up only 1/6 of R&D, and which businesses generally avoid due to its low profit potential. The average rate of return on R&D investments has been high, probably exceeding 20%. But research suggests that markets often undervalue companies with higher rates of research and development, since outside investors have trouble evaluating R&D, as there's much uncertainty about whether such investments will actually pay off. On the other hand, these investments create positive externalities, spillovers that aren't captured by the investors. Studies show that the social rate of return, which includes these positive externalities, is about 2.5 times as high as the private rate of return. These are huge positive externalities, and as we discussed in Lecture 1, positive spillovers are a very legitimate reason for government spending. The 2006 federal budget allocates $132 billion to R&D. That's $440 for every person in the country. But critics point out that 59% of this goes to military R&D, which doesn't spill over to civilian uses very well, arguing that more funding of basic research should be done. In addition, the Federal Research and Experimentation Tax Credit has been growing, but it still amounts to only a few $billions. However, whenever government spends money on subsidies, it's important to make sure that it isn't simply throwing money at a problem and isn't wasting money backing the wrong horse or some political darling. Examples of big government R&D projects that have been wasteful are easy to find, such as the failed Synthetic Fuels Corporation of the 1980s, or Europe's subsidies to the supersonic transport, the SST. Fortunately, most observers credit our competitive merit-based system through the NSF and other agencies as helping to ensure that this spending isn't a boondoggle. Finally, Tactic 4. The U.S. can remain as open as possible to foreign investment. One NBER study found that in a recent 10-year period, spillovers from foreign direct investment into the U.S. accounted for about 14% of American productivity growth. Ultimately, the primary source of productivity growth is new technology, whose flow may be accelerating over time as higher education is globalized. Beyond computers and information technology, there are many exceptionally promising new technologies in the wings, such as biotechnology stemming from recombinant DNA techniques, and nanotechnology enabled by the development of scanning probe microscopes. As higher education is increasingly globalized, with rising levels in China and India, for example, I expect the flow of new productive ideas from outside the U.S. to only increase at a rapid pace. Our corporations and higher education institutions have proven fairly open to interchanges with people from all over the world, and our multi-ethnic society puts us in a very strategic position to capitalize on these gains. There are a lot of things that we can do to spur productivity growth, but incentives to invest, increased education, subsidies to R&D, and global openness and flexible competitive markets seem to be the keys. One final note. Research consistently shows that rapid productivity growth helps hold down a bane of the economy, inflation, which is the topic we'll turn to in our next lecture. In Lecture 2, we briefly examined inflation, seeing that the Consumer Price Index grew at an alarming rate of about 7.5% per year in the 1970s, as prices more than doubled. Fortunately, the annual inflation rate has been much lower in recent years, averaging 3% in the 1990s and about 2.6% since then. In this lecture, we'll look more closely at how inflation is measured, criticisms of official inflation statistics, the problems that inflation and deflation can cause, and estimates of the optimal inflation rate. Then we'll turn to an examination of the underlying causes of inflation and a discussion of what economists think policymakers, especially the Federal Reserve Bank, should do about inflation. The most widely used estimate of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is calculated monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The CPI begins by constructing a market basket to reflect the purchases of the average urban household. This market basket is developed from detailed expenditure information provided by families and individuals on what they actually bought. For the current index, this information was collected from the Consumer Expenditure Survey in 2001 and 2002. In each of those years, about 10,000 families provided information on their spending habits in a series of interviews. To collect information on frequently purchased items, such as food and personal care products, another 15,000 families kept diaries listing everything they bought during a 2-week period. Altogether, more than 30,000 individuals and families provided expenditure information for use in determining the importance or weight of the more than 200 categories in the CPI. To see exactly where consumers are buying, the CPI uses another sample of about 17,000 families each year who serve as the basis for the point of purchase survey. Then, for each of the more than 200 item categories, the Bureau chooses several hundred specific items within selected business establishments patronized by consumers to represent the thousands of varieties available in the marketplace. For example, in a given supermarket, the Bureau may choose a 2-pound bag of Golden Delicious apples, U.S. extra fancy grade, to represent the apples category. Each month, the BLS data collectors visit or call thousands of retail stores, service establishments, and rental units all over the U.S. to obtain information on the prices of thousands of items used to track and measure price changes in the CPI. They record the prices of about 80,000 items each month, representing a scientifically selected sample of the prices paid by consumers. Essentially, then, the CPI estimates the typical market basket and then tracks its price over time. Of course, every once in a while, the market basket must be updated, since buying patterns change considerably over time. The current CPI uses the years 1982 to 1984 as the reference base, setting the basket's price equal to 100. In March 2006, the CPI reached 199.8, indicating that consumer prices had just about doubled in the 23 years since that base period. A year later, the CPI hit 205.3, a 2.8% increase from the previous March, indicating a one-year inflation rate of 2.8%. This method of estimating inflation has a lot going for it. But it also hides some problems that critics believe make it overstate the true rise in the cost of living. The first of these problems is known as the substitution bias, which arises because the CPI's method essentially locks consumers in to buying exactly the same basket no matter how relative prices of goods change, something that no rational consumer would do. For example, the CPI's market basket includes both apples and oranges. Suppose that over time the price of apples doubles, but the price of oranges stays the same. If this occurred, most consumers would react by buying fewer apples and more oranges, substituting away from the things whose relative prices have risen and toward those that haven't. But the CPI doesn't allow for this. The second problem involves the rotation of new retail outlets into the CPI sample. As buyers switch from one store to another, the CPI assumes that any price differences reflect a difference in quality. Thus, the fact that Home Depot sells a Black & Decker sander for $5 less than Sears reflects the poorer quality of the service received at the Home Depot. At least that's what the CPI assumes. This assumption's hard to justify. Although the service may be a little bit better at Sears, most consumers have switched to Home Depot because they don't value any lost service at $5 and they think they're getting a better deal. The third bias arises because the CPI's market basket is a little bit skewed. People responding to the underlying consumer expenditure survey sometimes forget what they purchased or don't know about what other family members have bought. And they even fib about what they buy. Broader statistics show discrepancies. For example, the CPI assumes that about 1% of consumer spending is on alcoholic beverages. But broader statistics show that the true figure is over twice as high. The fourth bias arises because when new goods come onto the market, such as digital cameras or DVD players, their prices often fall rapidly. However, this initial price decline isn't picked up by the CPI since the goods aren't yet part of that representative market basket, which gets updated only about once a decade. The fifth, and perhaps largest bias, creeps in because the quality of many goods gets better over time, and the CPI doesn't generally value these quality improvements. For example, new generations of prescription drugs simply work better than their precursors. Cars are more reliable, and TV sets give clearer pictures. Economists have debated at length about the size of these biases. The most widely cited estimate comes from the Senate Advisory Commission to study the CPI, headed by Stanford economist Michael Boskin. The Boskin Commission estimated in 1996 that the biases added up to overstate inflation by about 1.1 percentage points per year. The BLS made some adjustments to its methods in response, so more recent bias estimates include 0.8 percentage points a year from the General Accounting Office and 0.9 percentage points from economists David LeBeau and Jeremy Rudd. In the survey that I designed for this course, I asked professional economists about their take on this issue, and they concurred with these studies, with the median estimate of CPI bias at 1 percentage point per year. If these economists are correct, we could measure the rise in the cost of living more accurately by subtracting that 1 percentage point off of the CPI's inflation rate. The CPI reported an inflation rate of 2.8% from March 2006 to March 2007. Subtracting 1% probably gives a more accurate estimate of a 1.8% increase in the cost of living. This difference may seem small, but if it persists for years, as it probably has, it becomes big. With an inflation rate of about 3%, prices double in about 24 years. But they double in about 36 years with an inflation rate of 2%. Now, let's turn to why we care about the inflation rate in the first place. Inflation imposes some big costs on the economy, but it can generate some benefits too. When inflation occurs, it's hard to distinguish relative price changes. I've been buying milk for $3 a gallon at the same mini-mart for months. If there's no inflation in the economy, I'm pretty sure that this price is lower than the other places that I could shop. But then inflation hits, and the milk price rises to $3.30 a gallon. I think that its price must have risen relative to the store a couple blocks away, where milk has been selling for $3.10. So I hop in my car and I drive over there. The price there has risen just as much. Inflation has made the price signal noisier, requiring me to do more price comparisons, which wastes my time and other resources. Economists refer to these as shoe leather costs. Inflation can have some nasty tax consequences. For example, if you buy a stock for $10,000 and sell it for $20,000 several years later. In the interim, however, prices have doubled, so you didn't actually gain anything. In the eyes of the tax code, however, you've made a capital gain and would be taxed on it. This seems pretty unfair, and people don't take such things lying down. Instead, they hire tax consultants and economic analysts, and all this talent is wasted trying to figure out how to beat inflation rather than doing something productive, such as making more goods and services. This is essentially another shoe leather cost and can be pretty large. Incidentally, the demand for economists will probably rise a lot when inflation goes up, because we're the ones hired to figure out how to predict and beat it. Thus, we're eating into our own business when we advise that the inflation rate should be held down. Next, inflation requires businesses to change their prices more often. And sometimes it's costly to change prices. For example, when you need to send out a new sales catalog. Economists refer to these costs of changing prices as menu costs. Probably the greatest cost of inflation is the uncertainty that it creates. Empirical evidence shows that when the inflation rate is high, it's also more variable. Low inflation, then, means that it's easier to predict what prices will be next year. In the high inflation 1970s, the CPI inflation rates were, rounding to the nearest digit, 6, 3, 3, 9, 12, 7, 5, 7, 9, and 13%. When the numbers bounce around a lot like that, it's hard to know what's coming next. In 1979, it would have been pretty hard to predict that the inflation rates in the next 3 years would be 12, 9, and then 4%, for example. Compare this to the lower inflation rates beginning in 1995. These inflation rates were much less variable. Rounding to the nearest digit, they were 3, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 2, and 3. Now, given this trend, it wouldn't have been hard to come close to guessing the inflation rates in the next couple of years, which were about 3 and 3. The high inflation of the 1970s averaged 7.5%, and the change of inflation from year to year was also high, averaging about 3%, roughly 3 times higher than in the later low inflation period. Now, suppose that you're sitting down to decide, should I buy a new house? Should I expand my business? Should I borrow some money? The wisdom of buying, expanding, and borrowing depends crucially on future prices. But if inflation is variable, it's hard to know what future prices will be. High inflation means variable inflation, which means uncertainty. And when people are uncertain, they become cautious and wait. High inflation then can kill otherwise sensible economic activities, especially business projects and investments. Adding all these costs together, it seems clear that inflation will sap economic growth by diverting resources to unproductive uses and squelching investment. On the other hand, deflation, falling prices, might be even worse than inflation. Deflation generates the same uncertainty, menu costs and shoe leather costs, but it can also cause the economy to choke. First, think about what a desperate debtor would do in the face of deflation. She borrows $200,000 and buys a house for $220,000. Then deflation hits. So housing and all other prices go down. The price of the house falls to $180,000, but the owner owes $200,000. In this case, many people would simply walk away from the debt. Lots of mortgage companies get these houses, which were collateral for the loans, and when they try to sell them, the market's glutted and the price falls even more. Those that don't want to walk away from their debts often have to tighten their financial belts to pay off their debts, which have climbed in real terms. But this belt tightening can cut spending in the rest of the economy, dragging it down. This debt deflation cycle is believed by many economic historians to have been one of the key forces at work during the Great Depression. A second way that the economy chokes is that deflation can dry up credit. If prices are falling 5% a year, a loan with even a 2 or 3% nominal interest rate might be hard for the borrower to pay off. It might be safer and wiser for a lender to simply hold on to her money, which appreciates in value when there's deflation. In this case, real interest rates rise as credit becomes scarcer. Borrowing falls and investment falls. A third reason that deflation can hurt the economy is that it can cause people to just put off purchases, waiting for prices to fall, which leads to less demand and less hiring. Well, if inflation is bad and deflation is also bad, does this mean that the optimal inflation rate is 0? Most economists don't think so. While a lot of inflation may be bad, just a little inflation may be good. A little inflation allows the possibility of negative real interest rates. If bankers lend at 2% and the inflation rate is 3%, then the real, that is, inflation-adjusted interest rate is actually 2 minus 3, or negative 1%. If the Fed can push the real interest rate this low, it might really spur a stagnant economy. Second, a little inflation seems to make labor market adjustments easier. Workers tend to get a bit indignant if the boss cuts their pay. If I cut your pay from $10 to $9.50 an hour, you'd probably bristle. But what if demand for my product is falling, so I can't afford to keep you on unless I cut your wage? Here comes inflation to the rescue. It allows me to keep your nominal wage at $10 per hour because my product's price goes up. Thus, a little inflation may grease the wheels of the economy, allowing wages to adjust more smoothly and keeping financial markets from choking on near zero interest rates. Balancing everything out, then, a little inflation is probably good. What inflation rate should we aim for, then? To answer this question, I surveyed professional economists. Their ideal rate of inflation is about 2% a year, pretty close to what we've run in recent years. The next question, of course, is what should we do to achieve a 2% inflation rate? To answer this question, we need to understand the causes of inflation. Most economists believe that the underlying root cause of inflation is expansion of the money supply, with 81% of economists in a recent survey agreeing that inflation is caused primarily by too much growth in the money supply. This makes sense in simple supply and demand terms. When the supply of anything goes up relative to the demand, its price goes down. Accordingly, when the supply of money goes up relative to demand, its price goes down. But the price of a $20 bill isn't merely $20, it's what you must give up to get it. It's what you can buy with it. So if the supply of money goes up, its value drops, and it won't buy as much stuff. For example, it'll take $4 to buy a gallon of milk instead of $3. It'll take more money to buy everything. Oh yeah, that's what we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. That's inflation. More money means less valuable money, means inflation. But this oversimplifies things a bit because if the money supply didn't grow at all, we'd probably have deflation because the demand for money rises over time as the economy grows. In addition, more money isn't the only cause of inflation. Inflation arises whenever the overall demand for goods and services, the aggregate demand, in the economy grows faster than the overall supply of goods and services, the aggregate supply. Thus, if consumers, businesses, and the government try to buy more stuff, the overall price level will start to rise. Likewise, if the cost of inputs, including wages, the price of oil, and the price of machinery start to rise, the overall price level of goods and services will start to rise too. The job of keeping these forces in balance has fallen firmly into the hands of the Federal Reserve. It has a delicate assignment. Politicians, policymakers, and we citizens want the Fed to steer the economy just right so that it grows strongly and unemployment stays low, but also so that inflation stays low. It has to increase the money supply at just the right pace, but no one knows for sure what just the right pace is. To be more precise, many macroeconomic models judge the economy in comparison to its potential. No one's exactly sure what this potential is. If we're below potential, the unemployment rate is high and inflation is low, so we have room to boost the economy through tax cuts, increased government spending, or the Fed's main tool of increasing the money supply to cut interest rates. And this will reduce unemployment, expand GDP, and push inflation up only a bit. On the other hand, if we go above potential, then tax cuts, increased government spending, and increasing the money supply will unleash a nasty chain of events. The economy will grow a little, the unemployment rate will fall a little, but the beast of inflation will be aroused and prices will rise rapidly. The Fed has to make sure this doesn't happen. Former Fed Chair William McChesney Martin Jr. famously said that his job was to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. The Fed's tough assignment is to push us right up to potential without pushing us past it, without knowing exactly where potential is, and knowing that the impact of its actions are somewhat uncertain and will occur months after it has acted. It's trying to pilot a sailboat with a sluggish rudder and never quite knowing when the winds will shift. History shows that the Fed hasn't always done its job well. When the Fed got started, it was very constrained in its ability to increase or decrease the money supply. In this era, the U.S. was on the gold standard. So our money supply grew almost automatically whenever more gold was discovered and made its way into the money supply. During the Great Depression, however, we effectively went off the gold standard, giving the Fed the ability to increase the money supply by simply printing up some more dollar bills, or easier still, simply buying up government debt, Treasury securities, from banks and the public and crediting their accounts with extra deposits. With the constraint of the gold standard gone, the Fed could make more money whenever it wanted. And it seems to have abused this ability in the 1970s, as evidenced by the decade's rapid inflation. Why did the Fed, and indeed most other central banks around the world, allow such rapid inflation to arise during the late 1960s and the 1970s? In retrospect, it seems that policymakers of the time didn't realize that pushing the economy above potential would cause so much inflation. Didn't realize that they were pushing the economy above potential and didn't realize that inflation would hurt the overall economy so much. Many economists in the 1960s were tantalized by the historical record, which showed that low unemployment rates coincided with inflation rates that were only a little bit higher than average, a regularity dubbed the Phillips curve. Some advocated trying to hold down the unemployment rate, thinking that modest inflation, which would arise, would be a small price to pay. However, when we tried to do this, the inflation rate didn't stay low. Instead, people began to expect the inflation. And holding down the unemployment rate required an inflation rate that was higher than the new expectation. Added to this confusion were a couple of major spikes in the price of energy, which jolted the inflation rate upward as policymakers increased the money supply to offset the tendency of this energy crisis to slow the economy. When it became apparent that this strategy wasn't working well, these policymakers decided that it was time to focus on inflation. They decided, it seems, that while lower inflation may once have meant higher short-run unemployment, in the long run, lower inflation meant lower unemployment and faster economic growth. So if they focused on inflation, they could win the trifecta. Boosting the money supply in the short run can spur some extra economic growth, but in the long run, it results mainly in inflation and hampers economic growth. But there was still a potential problem. What was to stop short-sighted policymakers, concerned about things like re-election, from pushing the central bank to increase the money supply, helping to improve the short-run picture, but worsening things in the long run? In some countries, central bankers could be fired if they didn't do what elected leaders wanted. In others, central banks had much more secure jobs and greater autonomy. During the era of high inflation, it became more and more obvious that central bankers with greater independence held inflation rates lower, probably because they were able to ignore such political pressure. Accordingly, countries began to grant their central banks greater autonomy, and this seems to have allowed them to focus on longer-term goals, holding inflation rates down. The next step was to codify this understanding. The first country to do so was New Zealand. In 1989, New Zealand enacted a law that transformed the central bank from being one of the least independent to one of the most independent among the industrialized countries, and committed its reserve bank to the single policy objective of price stability. The act stipulated that the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Reserve Bank should negotiate agreements that specified numerical goals for inflation. And the Reserve Bank's governor eventually became subject to dismissal if inflation was outside the low assigned range. In the next 3 years, New Zealand was followed by Canada, Israel, Britain, Sweden, and Finland, and now more than 20 industrialized nations have explicit inflation targets, generally calling for an annual inflation rate of about 2%. These targets have been part of a broad move toward transparency or openness by central banks about what they're up to, allowing outsiders to get a good sense of what future policy will be, reducing the uncertainty among investors. Research seems to indicate that these moves have had real benefits, holding down inflation rates and boosting economic growth a bit. The U.S. Federal Reserve is unusually independent. Members of its Board of Governors are political appointees nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but they have 14-year terms and can't be dismissed. The 7 members' terms are staggered, with new appointments coming open only every 2 years, so that a 2-term president would be able to pack the board with a majority of his favorites only at the end of his tenure in office. Judges are about the only top government officials with this much job security and independence. Nowadays, presidents and Congress, who don't want to roil financial markets much, don't usually play politics with Fed appointments. Rather, they tend to select members who have solid reputations for conducting sound monetary policy with the goal of keeping inflation in check. What, then, should we do about inflation? The consensus that I see among economists is that we should be doing exactly what we are doing. In a recent survey, 70% of economists agreed that the Federal Reserve should focus on a low rate of inflation rather than any other possible goals, such as employment or economic growth. The financial market seems to live not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Fed chair and his fellow board members. Have they convinced investors that inflation is under control? Inflation expectations can be examined by looking at interest rates. If people expect inflation 5, 10, or 20 years down the road, they will demand a higher interest rate on 5, 10, or 20-year government debt. Alternatively, they can buy Treasury inflation-protected securities. The inflation rate difference between these two bonds is currently about 2.5% for 20-year securities. So market investors implicitly expect inflation to be about 2.5%. The Fed does not, however, have an explicit numerical target. Should they adopt one? Should we, like New Zealand, threaten to fire the Fed's chair if the target is missed? I haven't seen a survey asking these questions, but current Fed Chair Ben Bernanke has been warm toward the idea of targets. If the Fed did adopt an explicit inflation target, my survey respondents said that it should aim at about 2%. Recent research suggests that the Fed does have an implicit inflation target, and it aims for about 2.5%. That's exactly what investors are expecting. Still, these explicit and implicit targets will always have critics, even more so if the official inflation indicator is systematically biased. Because many observers believe that in times of trouble, it's more important to push the unemployment rate down, even if it means a little more inflation in the long run. We'll turn to this very issue, what should be done about unemployment, in the next lecture. While most people aren't enamored with work, they're much more fearful of unemployment, the inability to find a job when you're looking for one. Mention of the U word, unemployment, brings the haunting specter of bread lines during the Great Depression to many people's minds. In this lecture, we'll look closely at how the unemployment rate is measured and consider who is more likely to be unemployed. Then we'll turn to an examination of the underlying types and causes of unemployment and a discussion of what economic policies can do to influence the unemployment rate by comparing the differing strategies used in the U.S. and Europe. Economics is all about trade-offs, and greater labor market protections, which help many workers, seem to yield higher unemployment rates. What exactly is unemployment? How do we measure it? In the United States, unemployment estimates come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in conjunction with the Census Bureau, which monthly contact about 60,000 households who are a representative sample of the U.S. population. A series of questions are asked to categorize each person in a household who's 16 years or over as either employed, unemployed, or not in the labor force. At the simplest level, people with jobs are employed. People who are jobless, looking for a job and available for work are unemployed, and people who are neither employed nor unemployed, such as retirees, full-time homemakers, and full-time students, are counted as not in the labor force. Omitted from the sample are those in institutions such as prisons or mental hospitals, and those on active duty in the armed forces. These lines do get a little fuzzy sometimes. Employment counts part-time and temporary work, and you are counted as employed if you have a job, but you didn't work in the reference week for reasons such as vacation, illness, childcare problems, maternity leave, bad weather, an industrial dispute, or taking care of some personal obligation. Most of these employed but not working individuals are on vacation or ill. The line can be even blurrier between the unemployed and not in the labor force. To be counted as unemployed, one must have actively looked for a job within the prior 4 weeks and be currently available for work. But what does actively mean? The BLS defines actively looking for work as any of the following: contacting an employer, employment agency, school employment center, or even friends and relatives about job openings, sending out resumes or filling out applications, placing or answering ads, checking union or professional registers, or some other means of active job search. Passive methods of job search that don't result in job seekers actually contacting potential employers don't count, such as attending a job training program or merely reading the want ads. Also, workers expecting to be recalled from layoff are counted as unemployed whether or not they have actively searched for a job. Finally, the person must be available for work. If a student is searching for a summer or post-graduation job but isn't willing to begin now, for example, he or she is counted as not in the labor force. The biggest beef that critics have with these procedures concerns what are labeled discouraged workers. These are people who were once unemployed, actively searched for work, but never found a job match, or could never find someone to watch their kids or have some other issue, so that they got discouraged and gave up trying to get a job. If a suitable job situation arose, such people would take it. It's just that they've given up looking. In the most recent survey, the BLS estimates the number of discouraged workers at about 1.4 million. And about 400,000 of them had looked for work in the last year, but not in the last 4 weeks. The rest had an obstacle such as family obligations or school attendance. These numbers are actually pretty low in comparison to the size of the overall labor force, which continues to grow. At the time of this lecture, there are about 146 million employed people and 6.8 million unemployed people, yielding an unemployment rate of 4.5%. Adding in the 400,000 who looked within the last year but didn't look in the last 4 weeks would boost the unemployment rate from 4.5% to 4.7%. However, at times of high unemployment, the percentage of discouraged workers can get much higher. As I noted in Lecture 2, the U.S. unemployment rate has been fairly low so far in the 21st century. It averaged 6.2% in the 70s, 7.3% in the 80s, 5.8% in the 90s, and 5.1% since 2000. These trends hide a lot of variation across regions and subgroups of the population. At the time of this lecture, for example, the state-level unemployment rate is below 3% in Hawaii, Idaho, Nebraska, Montana, Utah, and Wyoming. But it's over 6% in Michigan and Mississippi. Mississippi is at 6.5%, but neighboring Alabama is at 3.4%. The unemployment rate was below 3% in 2006 in places like Honolulu, Hawaii, Charlottesville, Virginia, Ames, Iowa, and Gainesville, Florida, but over 10% on Mississippi's post-Katrina Gulf Coast and in Yuma, Arizona. These regional differences ebb and flow. So in recent years, few places have had unemployment rates that are chronically a lot higher than the national average. Unemployment differences are more persistent by population subgroup. Usually the unemployment rate is about the same for adult men and women. But teenagers have a much higher unemployment rate. Currently, this is 3 times higher than the overall average. The rate for African Americans is generally much higher as well. Normally, this rate is about twice as high as for whites, although the rate for Hispanics is only a little above that for whites, and the Asian American rate is often a bit lower. Economists typically subdivide unemployment into 3 categories: frictional, structural, and cyclical. And they point out that not all unemployment is bad. Frictional unemployment arises due to the normal turnover of labor. Even when the economy is doing fine, jobs are continuously being destroyed due to changes in demand and competition among firms. In most periods, these flows are pretty high. In any given 3-month period, 1 in 13 jobs is created or destroyed. Likewise, when the economy is doing fine, people enter or re-enter the labor force. These job losers and entrants don't take the first job that comes along. Doing so would be stupid. Instead, if they are rational maximizers, they'll weigh the marginal cost versus the marginal benefit of job search. Search takes time and has an opportunity cost, giving up earnings from the first job that's available. But it has benefits too, the likelihood of finding a better job. Likewise, when employers are looking to hire, they don't take the first person who comes along. They often interview many candidates, trying to find the best match. This process of finding the best match is frictional unemployment. Even when production was going full guns during the height of World War II, the U.S. unemployment rate didn't fall all the way to zero due to frictional unemployment, which is good in an important sense because it allows better employment matches and allows more productive firms to replace less productive firms, both of which make the economy more productive. In the case of frictional unemployment, the number of unemployed workers is about equal to the number of vacancies, but it just takes a little time to fit these workers into these vacancies. The better and faster the labor market processes information, the lower this frictional unemployment will be. And the American labor market is noted for being efficient in matching such displaced workers with new jobs. Structural unemployment is much more worrisome. In this case, the number of vacancies is about equal to the number of unemployed workers, but these workers don't fit well into the vacancies. Suppose that the unemployment rate is only 2% in Montana, and there are lots of vacancies there, but the unemployed workers live in Michigan. Uprooting your life or your family and moving all the way across country is tough, so the unemployed workers are hesitant to do so, even though they could get a job. In addition to this spatial mismatch, there may be a skill mismatch. Suppose job openings are plentiful for people with computer skills, but the unemployed workers are, let's say, factory workers. With enough training, the unemployed workers may get into these jobs, but it doesn't happen very quickly. This kind of structural unemployment was prevalent during the 1970s and 80s as the Rust Belt shed a lot of jobs and workers had to retrain or move to the Sun Belt to find work. A third source of structural unemployment is when an employer is considering hiring a worker and a worker would like the job, but some kind of rule or law prevents the job match. Frictional and structural unemployment added together are often called the natural rate of unemployment. In a recent survey, 2/3 of economists agreed that there is a natural rate of unemployment to which the economy tends in the long run. There are a range of estimates for this natural rate. The Congressional Budget Office, for example, puts the current natural rate around 5%, down from 6.3% in the late 1970s. This decline may be due to a range of factors, including the decline in the portion of the labor force who are very young workers, the increased generosity of the disability insurance system, which has pulled a group of workers with high unemployment rates out of the labor market, an uptick in productivity growth, and the end of the wrenching restructuring of the 70s and 80s. The third kind of unemployment, cyclical unemployment, arises when the economy falls into a recession and employers stop hiring or lay off a lot of workers. One reason this type of unemployment arises is that wages are sticky. That is, employers don't generally cut their workers' wages, even in time of recession, unless things are very bad. Because they don't cut wages, they have to scale back the size of their workforce. If they could cut wages, they'd probably be willing to keep more of their workers employed. Why don't wages fall during recessions? Interviews show that business executives rarely cut pay because they fear that they'll undermine morale, harm productivity, and increase turnover. Essentially, laying off workers exports much of the employer's problem. The workers who get the axe aren't around anymore to complain, and those who've kept their jobs are grateful, knowing that they could have been given the heave-ho but were spared. They may work even harder to make sure that they don't get sacrificed if even more belt-tightening occurs. If instead wages are cut across the board, you'd have a lot of grumbling workers who aren't as productive and who are much more likely to quit when the economy perks back up. Sticky wages are one of several forces that can stop the labor market from reaching equilibrium, where supply equals demand. When wages are set above the equilibrium level, the supply of labor outstrips the demand for labor. More people are looking for work than employers are willing to hire, and the gap between supply and demand measures unemployment. For example, labor unions can push wages above the equilibrium, causing employers to hire fewer workers. One government policy that can push some wages above the equilibrium is a minimum wage law. Another government policy that can have a tremendous impact on the unemployment rate and the well-being of the unemployed and the economy as a whole is unemployment insurance. The unemployment insurance system is financed by a payroll tax on employers. The tax rate is experience rated. That is, it rises somewhat when an employer has a history of laying off more workers, although doubling the layoff propensity won't double the tax. The experience rating means that employers have an incentive to cut back on some layoffs so that their tax rate won't rise. Unemployment insurance rules differ considerably from state to state, but the basic rule is that workers are eligible for unemployment insurance if they've earned enough in the previous year or so. The amount that equals enough varies from state to state and is generally a couple $1,000s. In addition, they are eligible for insurance only if they became unemployed through no fault of their own, i.e., not due to things like getting fired for misconduct, returning to school, becoming self-employed, or simply quitting. Thus, many unemployed workers are not eligible for this insurance. To receive benefits, the worker must also show willingness to take an appropriate job opening. At the peak of the 1990s boom, for example, only 35% of unemployed men and 23% of unemployed women received unemployment insurance benefits. And critics say these eligibility rules should be changed so that more unemployed workers receive benefits. Most economists and voters like the idea of unemployment insurance, which was designed so that laid-off workers won't have to rush out and take the first job that comes along, allowing them to wait for a good match and allowing them to continue spending while unemployed. Any unemployment insurance system, however, must be careful to balance things so that workers have high enough benefits to look for a good job, but not benefits that are so high that they have little incentive to take a new job. According to the Department of Labor, average benefits in the U.S. are about $270 a week. And the average replacement rate, unemployment insurance benefits as a percentage of previous wages, is about 36%. In most cases, workers are eligible for benefits for a maximum of 26 weeks, although this was temporarily extended to 39 weeks right after the recessions of 1981, 91, and 2001. Some critics complain that both the replacement rate and the maximum duration are too stingy. What then explains why the U.S. unemployment rates, which were high in the 1970s and 80s, have come back down, but unemployment rates in much of Europe, which were once much lower than in the U.S., are now much higher than in the U.S. In 1973, just before the post-World War II golden age of rapid economic growth ended, the U.S. unemployment rate was 4.8%, somewhat below our longer-term average. In Germany, however, the unemployment rate was a spectacular 0.8%. The rate was about 2 or 3% in Belgium, Finland, France, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and Britain. The average in other developed countries was about 3%. Then the rate soared when all these economies slowed their growth and were forced to restructure due to surging energy prices and slowing productivity growth. In 1984, the U.S. unemployment rate had climbed to 7.4%, but it averaged almost 9% in these other rich countries. By 1999, the U.S. rate was all the way back down, only 4.2%. But the rate stayed high in the European Union, averaging 9.2%. In the most recent period, the U.S. rate is 4.5%, and the Eurozone unemployment rate is about 7.5%, with rates right around 9% in Germany, France, and Spain, although much lower in some European countries, such as the British Isles and Scandinavia. Much of the gap is because unemployment spells tend to last much longer in Europe. In 1999, 62% of unemployed men in the EU had been unemployed for 6 months or more. 62%. The rate was only 13% in the U.S. The differences for women were even wider. In addition, the unemployment rate among young people aged 15 to 24 was about 10% in the U.S., but 16% for men and 19% for women in the EU. And it's not just unemployment. The not in the labor force category is generally a lot larger in Europe than in the United States. In 1999, for example, among those aged 15 to 64, about 16% of American men were not in the labor force, but the rate was 22% in the European Union, 6 percentage points higher. Among women, the EU's not in the labor force rate was 11 percentage points higher. What explains this variation? Some of it, of course, is random due to temporary ups and downs in the economy, but most of the gap seems to be more permanent, a difference in the natural rate of unemployment. Labor economists who have empirically investigated these differences generally conclude that they have to do with labor market institutions and rules, which differ dramatically. Economists like Francine Blau and Lawrence Kahn have concluded that the U.S. has a broad set of institutions which make employers willing to hire more workers, and workers more willing to go out and fill job openings. American labor markets are more flexible and less likely to have wages set above the equilibrium level, which, of course, opens a gap between labor supply and labor demand. European laws tend to compress the wage distribution, boosting unemployment somewhat, but reducing inequality. First, European unionization rates are much higher than in the U.S. In most countries, a majority of workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements that can make reallocating workers difficult and can set wages so high that firms cut back employment and look to foreign sources for workers. Collective bargaining covers about 90% of workers in Germany and France and nearly 80% in Italy and Spain. However, only about 14% of U.S. workers are covered by such collective bargaining agreements. Second, the minimum wage is much higher relative to the median wage in most European countries, exceeding half of the median wage in countries like France, Belgium, and Greece. It's only about 30% of the median wage in the U.S. This high minimum wage seems to make it especially hard for younger and less skilled workers to get jobs in Europe. Recall the 2005 riots around Paris, in which one of the major complaints was the difficulty faced by young people trying to find jobs. Third, unemployment insurance in the U.S. is much less generous to job losers. The wage replacement ratio in the U.S. is around 36%, but it's often over half in European countries. Likewise, American workers are usually eligible for only 6 months of benefits, but maximum durations exceed a year in most European countries, and benefits can be collected indefinitely in some. In essence, the American approach is to light a fire under unemployed workers, cushioning them somewhat, but strongly encouraging them to get a job. Some European countries have begun moving toward this approach, such as Germany, which recently cut the maximum duration of benefits for most workers from 3 years to 1 year. Unemployment insurance and higher unemployment benefits clearly lengthen spells of unemployment, with those ineligible for insurance in the U.S. finding jobs in about half the time of those receiving benefits. This suggests that combating unemployment means confronting a big trade-off. To hold down the unemployment rate requires pushing some workers into somewhat less desirable, lower-paying jobs. Europeans tend to hold up the wages of workers near the bottom of the income distribution through collective bargaining, minimum wages, and holding down the supply of such workers by granting lengthy unemployment insurance benefits. But this boosts their unemployment rate. Americans lean in the other direction, adopting policies that tend to boost employment but may reduce the wages of lower-earning workers. So, what should we do about unemployment? When unemployment has soared due to an economic slowdown, just about everyone agrees that the answer is to have the government boost the economy by spending more, cutting taxes, or especially cutting interest rates, pulling the economy back to potential and back to the natural rate of unemployment, as long as none of these policies lead to excessive inflation. But the solution to a higher natural rate of unemployment is less clear-cut. One solution is to allow labor markets to be flexible and move toward equilibrium. But this leads to higher inequality. The other tack is to hold down inequality, but this seems to lead to more unemployment. Are there other solutions to high unemployment? What about making it hard for employers to fire workers? Will requirements like mandated severance pay or impediments to collective dismissals lead employers to lay off fewer workers? Perhaps they will, but they also make employers less likely to want to hire these workers in the first place if they know that it's difficult to unhire them later when conditions change. European countries tend to have much stricter laws requiring severance pay and setting up roadblocks to restructuring workforces. In France, for example, dismissals involving 10 workers or more require notification to the government, consultations with worker representatives, a relatively long waiting period, and severance pay. In the U.S., these policies are quite alien. The only significant requirement is due to the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, the WARN Act, which requires that employers warn employees at least 60 days ahead of time when 100 or more non-temporary and non-short-hour workers will be laid off. No negotiations or severance pay is mandated in the U.S. What about pushing employers to share work? This could be done by cutting the maximum work week or setting exorbitant overtime penalties. Won't cutting the maximum work week by about 10% from 39 to 35 hours mean that employers will want to hire about 10% more workers so they don't have to cut back output? Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to work this way. In 2000, France cut its official maximum work week from 39 to 35 hours, hoping to cure unemployment. But employers were hesitant to hire, and unemployment wasn't affected much. Numerous studies of U.S. overtime pay laws have concluded that such laws have little impact on overall employment. What about simply training unemployed workers to make them more employable? This idea has broad popular appeal, even though it requires government to spend taxpayers' money, unlike the other regulations and employer mandates we've discussed. It may be that such spending will pay for itself by boosting the future earnings and taxes paid by the affected workers. In fact, for years, Sweden spent about 3% of GDP on government labor market programs, and Germany has spent about 2%, compared to less than 0.5% in the U.S. Most research, however, finds that government job training programs have small effects on wages and reemployment. And cross-country analysis suggests that such spending is associated with higher unemployment rates. Because the reviews of these other solutions are decidedly mixed, this returns us to the broader conclusion. The principal way to have a low unemployment rate in the long run is to have a flexible labor market, which works efficiently to match workers and jobs, devoid of institutions that push wages above the equilibrium level, discourage employers from hiring, and discourage workers from getting jobs. Unfortunately, these very same institutions seem to increase economic inequality. What can we do about economic inequality? This is the subject of our next lecture. The last lecture concluded that economic inequality is higher in the U.S. than in many other economically advanced nations, partly due to policies we've adopted to hold down the unemployment rate. In this lecture, we'll begin by examining measures and trends in inequality. Then we'll look at the forces that drive inequality, forces which give some individuals much higher consumption, income, and wealth levels than others, and which have increased inequality in recent decades. Technological changes are seen by most economists as the primary force driving up inequality in the U.S. in recent decades. We'll close by examining programs designed to reduce inequality, especially by transferring resources from the rich to the poor. Because reducing inequality generally also means reducing economic efficiency, that is, making the slices of the economic pie more equal, tends to shrink the overall size of the economic pie. And because reducing inequality benefits some people at the expense of others, it's hard to reach a consensus on what we should do about inequality. There are a wide range of measures of economic inequality. None of them is perfect. The most widely used measure looks at households' incomes using data collected in the Census Bureau's Current Population Survey. Let's begin with this. Every year, the Census Bureau asks a representative set of respondents about almost 24 different categories of income they might have received. Labor market earnings plus income from 8 government programs, unemployment compensation, workers' comp, Social Security, supplementary security income, public assistance, veterans payments, survivors benefits, and disability payments, as well as income from pensions, interest payments, dividends, rents, royalties, estates and trusts, educational assistance, alimony, child support, financial assistance from outside the household, and any other monetary income. This income data, therefore, covers monetary income received before payments for income taxes and Social Security taxes, and does not reflect the fact that some families receive non-cash public benefits, such as food stamps, medical coverage, and subsidized housing. They also leave out the monetary value of non-wage job benefits, such as retirement and health insurance packages. And the census warns that households tend to underreport their non-wage sources of income. According to the census, in 2005, the 20% of households with the lowest incomes had monetary incomes averaging about $11,000 a year. The next highest 20% averaged about $27,000 a year. The middle 20% averaged about $46,000 per year. The fourth highest averaged about $73,000 per year. And the top 20% averaged $160,000 per year. Clearly, this is nowhere near equality. The bottom group received 3.4% of income. The middle group received 14.6%, and the top group received almost exactly half of the income. According to the Census Bureau, these shares have gotten less equal over time, with inequality rising noticeably since about 1975, when the bottom 20% garnered 4.3% of income, The middle earned 17%, and the top took in 43.6%. To repeat, in the last 3 decades or so, the bottom share has fallen from 4.3 to 3.4%. The middle share has fallen from 17 to 14.5%, and the top share has risen from about 44 to about 50%. This set of statistics has been collected since shortly after World War II, but longer-term measures indicate that the period from about World War II to 1975 was fairly unique, with about the lowest level of income inequality in the history of the country. The recent rise in income inequality brings us roughly back to the level that held before the Great Depression, although I must caution that statistics are thinner for the earlier period, so exact comparisons are iffy. However, critics of these statistics say that they overstate income inequality and its rise in important ways. For example, poor households tend to be smaller and rich households tend to be larger. The bottom quintile contains 20% of households, but only 15% of people. The top quintile contains about 24% of people. In addition, because of misreporting and temporary aberrations, it might be better to look at inequality of money spent, consumption, rather than income. Data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey shows that the bottom quintile share of consumption is about 9%. That's almost 3 times higher than their share of income. The middle quintile share of consumption is 17%, somewhat above their share of income, and the top quintile's share of consumption is about 43%, considerably below their 50% share of income. While consumption is much more equal than income, and surprisingly it has not trended upward much in the past few decades, consumption is still clearly unequal, with the top 20% consuming about 3 times as much more per person as the bottom 20%. In addition, financial wealth is much less equally distributed than either consumption or income, with the top 20% of households owning 80% of housing value and financial assets. Official estimates suggest that income inequality in the U.S. rose consistently from about 1975 to the early 1990s and has risen more slowly since then. Some scholars are skeptical, however, arguing that most of this trend is driven by estimates of rising income to the top 1% of the population, and noting that these estimates are skewed by changes in the law that led business profits to be reported under individual taxes after individual tax rates came down in the 1980s. These factors probably do overstate the rise in inequality somewhat, but I doubt that they overturn the broad trend, which can be seen outside the top 1%. For example, the ratio of income at the 90th percentile compared to the 10th percentile climbed from 8.5 in 1975 to over 11 in 2005. So the bottom line is that most economists believe that income inequality has risen noticeably over the past generation, although consumption inequality probably hasn't increased by much. To compress the income distribution into a single number, economists like to convert these income data into a graph called the Lorenz curve, which plots the cumulative share of income on the vertical axis and the cumulative share of households on the horizontal axis. The Lorenz curve bulges out from the graph's 45-degree line, or line of equality, and one can calculate the ratio of the area between the Lorenz curve and the line of equality to the total area below the line of equality. This ratio, which is often multiplied by 100 for ease of presentation, is called the Gini coefficient, a single number that summarizes inequality. A Gini coefficient of 0 means that all households have the exact same income. A Gini coefficient of 100 means that one household gets all the loot and the rest get none. The U.S. Gini coefficient, according to the United Nations, currently about 41. a number that's meaningless to just about everyone who's not an economist, but which can be useful for comparisons over time and space. After adjusting for some changes in how the numbers were collected, official statistics show that the U.S. Gini coefficient has risen about 6 points since the early 1970s. To put these numbers into context, let's compare income inequality internationally using the Gini coefficient. And just to be clear, the UN figures differ somewhat from the census figures, but I'll use them so that we can make these international comparisons. Among the most economically equal countries in the world, with Ginis at or below 30, are many small European countries such as Austria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and all the Scandinavian countries, as well as Germany and Japan, plus a handful of poorer countries including Ethiopia. In the low to mid-30s are Australia, Bangladesh, Britain, Canada, Egypt, France, India, Indonesia, Italy, Pakistan, Poland, South Korea, and Spain. In the high 30s, a bit below the U.S., are Israel, Jamaica, Portugal, Russia, and Vietnam. The average Gini coefficient in the 125 countries on the UN's list is 40.5, almost exactly the same rate as in the U.S. But almost all the countries with higher levels of inequality than the U.S. are much poorer than it. China's Gini is about 44. Other countries in the mid-40s are Nigeria, the Philippines, Turkey, and Venezuela. Mexico's is about 50. Among the highest in the world are many nations in Latin America and Africa, with Brazil, Haiti, and Bolivia near 60. Topping the chart is Namibia in Southwest Africa at 74. Ironically, the Gini coefficient for the world as a whole is almost higher than for any single country, at about 60. Since rich people tend to live with other rich people fairly equally in rich countries, and poor people tend to live with other poor people fairly equally in poorer countries. The bottom line from this international comparison is that the U.S.'s level of inequality is average by world standards, but somewhat high by the standards of rich countries. The income of any individual or household is determined by a complex mix of individual choices, societal choices, and plain old luck. The individual choices include how much to work, how hard to work, how much education to obtain, what type of career to pursue, how much to save and invest, and who to marry. Impersonal societal choices through the global market and political decisions determine the average wage that can be earned in each type of work, and more personal societal choices determine whether or not people treat you fairly or unfairly. Luck will determine things like your health, how much you inherit, where you were born, your genes, how you were raised, and who you marry. Hey, that went on 2 separate lists. Obviously, the 3 sets of forces interact. For example, you might decide to work longer and harder if your wage rate, determined by the market, were to rise. But you can't work as hard if your health starts to fail. Most people would prefer it if individual choices were the main factors driving income inequality, not luck. Census findings demonstrate some of these factors at work. For example, 59% of the households in the bottom quintile have no wage earners, and most of those that do work in these households work part-time. In the middle 3 quintiles, 15% have no wage earners, 42% have 1 wage earner, and 43% have 2 or more. But in the top quintile, 76% of the households have 2 or more wage earners. Individuals in the top 20% earn about $8.60 in income for every $1 earned by those in the bottom group. But they also perform about 4.7 times as much work. Keeping these factors in mind, what has caused the recent rise in inequality in the U.S.? To answer this question, most economists focus on the labor market. Since the vast majority of income is earned in the labor market, for all groups except the bottom quintile, which earns almost as much from government transfers as from work. Let's compare full-time, year-round workers. In 1975, middle-aged male college graduates earned about 51% more than middle-aged men who had graduated only from high school. By 2003, this reached 85%. Among women, the college premium rose from 36 to 76%. Wow! Those are pretty big differences. The payoff from college has nearly doubled. Once we've adjusted properly for changes in the cost of living, the pay of the less educated workers has climbed a little bit, but the pay of the better educated workers has climbed a lot. The pay has climbed most for the highest educated workers. In 2005, wages averaged about $57,000 per year for workers who had graduated from college. $68,000 for those with master's degrees, $94,000 for those with PhDs, and $119,000 for people with MBAs, MDs, and law degrees. Wages at the top of the educational distribution have risen a lot relative to those at the bottom. You probably already knew this, but why has this happened? It can't be mainly due to changes in supply, since the supply of college-educated workers has risen tremendously. The share of college-educated women has roughly doubled since 1980, and the share of college-educated men has increased by about 60%. Demand must be the key. The demand for better educated workers must have risen rapidly in comparison to the demand for less educated workers. A myriad of forces are at work, but in a recent survey, 65% of economists put technological change as the primary reason for increased income inequality. The top second choices are international trade and demographic shifts. First, let's explain the big fish, technological change, and then we'll turn our attention to international trade and demographic changes. Since the mid-1970s, technological innovations have increasingly allowed machines to do many jobs once done by less educated workers, especially what former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich refers to as routine production jobs in his insightful book, The Work of Nations. For example, in 1970, the number of telephone operators in the U.S. was about 410,000. This fell almost in half in the next 20 years and is now down to about 30,000, as electronic switching equipment and computer software have made this job almost completely obsolete. Other examples include ATMs replacing many bank tellers, computerized scanners reducing the number of retail clerks that need to be hired, self-service gasoline pumps, and a host of back-breaking jobs disappearing with the introduction of forklifts, cranes, and most recently, robots. The number of autos produced in the U.S. jumped about 30% from 1979 to 1998, but the number of vehicle assembly workers fell by almost 30%, as these workers were increasingly replaced by machines. The Department of Labor expects these trends to continue, predicting, for example, big drops in overall employment of stock clerks, file clerks, and meter readers, as these tasks are increasingly automated. If these technological changes were the only factor at work, real wages of less educated workers would have fallen. But their wages have risen a bit because other economic changes have boosted the demand for less educated workers. The primary offsetting factor is probably that in a growing economy with rising incomes, people have increasingly demanded what Reich refers to as in-person services, noting our insatiable appetite for attention from other people. There are many jobs, such as in childcare, retailing, including restaurant and hotel sectors, and in the booming healthcare industry. The increased demand for labor in these sectors seems to have offset the drop in demand in the routine production sector, allowing the wages of less educated workers to rise a bit, but to fall relative to the wages of better educated workers. Meanwhile, new technologies have made better educated workers especially those Reich refers to as symbolic analysts, more productive, boosting the demand for their labor. A doctor, lawyer, executive, engineer, or scientist who grapples with ideas and information is much more productive with a computer on his or her desk or some other new technological marvel at his or her disposal. Research shows that the payoff to those who use mathematics in their work has risen even more rapidly than for other well-educated workers. Technology has been especially potent in accelerating the payoffs of economic superstars, from star singers and athletes to CEOs and writers. Take the pay of professional baseball players. In the late 1970s, after competition for ball players began with the arrival of free agencies, the highest paid baseball player was Mike Schmidt of the Phillies, who earned an impressive $561,000 a year. 24 years later, Alex Rodriguez signed with the New York Yankees for an annual pay of $22 million. A-Rod might be a bit better of a ball player than Iron Mike, but adjusting for inflation, his annual pay is more than 13 times higher. Why have salaries at the top soared like this? Economists point to technological changes and rising incomes as the key. Baseball is a luxury good, not a necessity. Thus, as people get richer, they're willing to pay more for it, and willing to pay even more to see the very best in action. If I've got money to spend, why not spend it seeing the very best, Schmidt or A-Rod, rather than a local minor league team? Technological changes have made it easier and easier to see the very best. First came TV, which killed a lot of the demand for minor league play and boosted the demand for big league play. Then came color TV, instant replay and close-up views, cable TV, satellite TV, and then big screen TV, making the viewing experience better and better. Between 1971 and 1990, for example, nominal player salaries rose 1,741%, while national TV revenues rose 1,742%. This strong correlation is no accident. Or take this example, which may be closer to home. Robert Greenberg is a musical historian and composer and a brilliant teacher and speaker. People in the Bay Area where he teaches have known about this for years. But his lectures could only be attended by a few hundred or perhaps 1,000 people at a time until new technology intervened and someone here at the teaching company had the brilliant idea of taping and filming his lectures and selling them on tapes, CDs, and eventually DVDs. Each of these innovations made him more productive, boosting the demand for his services and those of other people like him. Such technological progress has been a dominant force in U.S. history, but analysts believe that the key during the past few decades is that new technology and machines have been a substitute for lower educated workers, capable of taking their places and thus cutting the demand for their labor, but a complement for better educated workers, capable of making them more productive and thus boosting the demand for their labor. The next major factor driving up income inequality is increased international trade. Like some of the new technologies, and in combination with them, it has made it easier and easier for producers to substitute away from less educated American workers. Although such workers are low paid by American standards, comparable workers in poorer countries can be hired for much less. Better educated workers, on the other hand, seem to become more productive when they can sell their output on a global market, rather than only on a national market, and when they can use cheaper imported inputs. The threat of international trade to wages and the standard of living of less educated American workers shouldn't be exaggerated, however, because there is a big safety net in place. The safety net of growing demand for services which must be supplied in person. We will discuss the issue of outsourcing in much greater detail next lecture.